Elowen Mercer slammed her hand flat on that table so hard the tin cups rattled and every cowboy in the room went dead silent. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She looked at Gideon Vale straight across that table and said, "You're not offering help. You're buying a noose and asking us to put it around our own necks." Gideon's jaw tightened. The room held its breath, and the one man who could have stopped all of it, the quiet cowboy leaning against the back wall, said nothing. Not yet. If this story already has your heart beating faster, do yourself a favor and subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button so you never miss a story like this one. And when you're done watching, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me because what happens next will change everything you think you know about who really held the power at Silver Creek Ranch. The position advertisement had been nailed to the post outside the general store in Laramie for 11 days before Elowen Mercer pulled it down. She stood on the boardwalk in the cold October morning, reading it twice. Ranch cook wanted, Silver Creek Ranch, Weston County. Room and board provided, $15 per month. Experience required, references preferred. She had experience. She did not have references she could use. The last household that had employed her had closed after the husband died, and the widow sold everything and moved back east, and the letter of recommendation that woman had promised never arrived. And Elowen had stopped waiting for it somewhere around the middle of August when the money she had saved was no longer enough to cover both food and a room. She folded the advertisement and put it in her coat pocket. The next morning she was on the stage heading west. The driver told her the ranch was remote. She said she didn't mind remote. He said the last cook had lasted less than 2 weeks. She didn't ask why. She already knew that kind of information was meant to discourage her, and she had decided somewhere on the road out of Laramie that she was done being discouraged. Silver Creek Ranch appeared in the late afternoon of the second day, a collection of buildings spread across a shallow valley, surrounded by grassland that had gone brown and dry with the coming of autumn. The main house was solid, built from timber and stone, with a wide front porch and windows that caught the last of the afternoon light. The bunkhouse sat to the north. The barn was east of that. A cookhouse had been built a short distance from the main house, which told Elowen something important. Whoever built this place had understood that a cook needed her own space and her own domain. She stepped off the stage with her worn leather suitcase and took a slow look around. A man came off the porch of the main house and walked toward her. He was tall, lean, somewhere in his late 40s, with a weathered face and a foreman's bearing, the kind of man who had spent 20 years giving orders outdoors and wore that authority naturally. "You the cook," he said. Elowen said. "Elowen Mercer." "Harlan Creed," he said. "I run the operation here." "You got references?" "I have experience," she said. "Which matters more than paper." Harlan looked at her for a moment, then at the suitcase, then back at her face. "Kitchen's this way," he said. "You can judge for yourself whether you're staying." She followed him to the cookhouse, and he opened the door and stepped back. She walked in. The stove was a large cast-iron range that had clearly not been properly maintained. One of the 2 firebox doors was warped and wouldn't seal completely, which meant heat escaped unevenly and anything you put in the oven cooked wrong. The work table had a split running down the center of it. 2 of the 4 wooden shelves on the back wall had bowed under the weight of supply cans and were in danger of pulling their brackets loose from the wall. The water barrel near the side door was empty. There was no fresh water in the cookhouse at all. She walked to the supply shelf and looked at what she had. Flour not enough, salt pork, some dried beans, a reasonable amount. Very little. Coffee, almost gone, sugar. Half a small crock lard, enough for a week if she was careful. 2 partial sacks of oats, a string of dry peppers. 3 cans of peaches, 6 cans of tomatoes, 15 men. 3 meals a day. She stood there doing the arithmetic in her head, and the arithmetic was not comfortable. "How long since the last order of supplies?" she asked. 3 weeks, Harlan said. Supply run was delayed. Road washed out. When's the next one? 10 days, weather permitting. She turned around and looked at him. Harlan, you're going to need to tell me something honestly. Are the men used to eating well, or are they used to eating enough? Harlan's expression shifted just slightly, but she caught it. They're used to eating, he said. The last cook didn't stretch what we had. Burned through most of the reserves in the first week. That's why she didn't last the second, Elowen said. That's part of it. What's the other part? Harlan didn't answer right away. The men weren't always respectful, he said finally. Were any of them, she asked? Something in Harlan's face shifted again, not quite a smile, but close. One, he said. She didn't ask who. That first evening, Elowen built a fire in the broken range and learned its temper. Every stove had one. This one ran hotter on the left side and cooler on the right, and the warped door created a draft problem that could be partially corrected by propping the side vent at a specific angle. She burned her first batch of biscuits testing that, scraped them, started again, and by the time she had figured out the stove's behavior, she had also figured out how to use it. She fed 15 men beans and cornbread and salt pork that first night. Nobody complained. A few of them looked at each other as if they expected someone else to complain first. Nobody did. After supper, she sat alone at the work table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil and wrote down every item in the supply room with its approximate quantity. Then she calculated how long those supplies would last at 3 meals a day for 15 men under normal conditions. Then she recalculated for reduced portions, substitutions, and stretching strategies, using the beans more heavily in the first week to preserve the salt pork, rotating the canned goods carefully, making the coffee last by cutting it slightly with ground chicory if she could find any. The arithmetic was tight, but it worked. 10 days was survivable. She was still writing when she heard the door of the cookhouse open. She didn't turn around immediately. She heard the sound of boots on the plank floor, a single person, moving quietly, and then a pause near the stove where the coffee pot sat. There's still some in the pot, she said without looking up. Help yourself. A pause. Then the sound of a cup being lifted and coffee being poured. She finished her calculation and turned around. The man standing at the stove was not one she had noticed at supper, or rather, she had noticed him, but only in the way you notice a piece of furniture that is exactly where it should be, and therefore doesn't draw the eye. He was somewhere around 35, average height, lean and rope-strong, with dark hair worn a little long under his hat, and a face that was calm in the way of a man who has decided not to waste expression on things that don't require it. You one of the hands, she asked. Yes, ma'am, he said. You weren't at supper. I was working late, he said. Fencing on the north pasture. She nodded and looked back at her paper. There's leftover beans and cornbread in the pot and on the shelf. Cold, but they're there. Thank you, he said. He sat down at the far end of the bench near the stove with his coffee and didn't say anything else. She went back to her calculations. He sat there drinking his coffee and reading nothing and saying nothing. And there was something about the quality of his silence that was different from the uncomfortable silence of a man who doesn't know what to say. It was the silence of someone who simply didn't feel the need to fill the air with noise. After a while, she said without looking up, You know this ranch well? Well enough, he said. The supply situation is worse than it should be, she said. I'm managing it, but I want to know if there are other gaps I haven't found yet. Things the last cook didn't notice or didn't report. A pause. The root cellar under the main house has smoked venison from the fall hunt, he said. 3 haunches. Nobody mentioned it because the last cook never asked. She stopped writing. She looked up at him. Nobody told me about a root cellar. Nobody told you because you didn't ask, he said. Not unkindly, just as a fact. Where is it? North side of the main house. Cellar doors half hidden by the wood stack. She wrote that down. Anything else? There's a stand of wild roships about a quarter-mile east along the creek, he said. Still have some fruit on them this time of year. Good for keeping the men from getting sick when vegetables run short. She looked at him more carefully. How do you know that? My mother used them, he said, when things were short. She nodded slowly. What's Silas, he said. Silas Rourke. Well, Silas Rourke, she said, turning back to her paper. You just made the next 10 days considerably less difficult. He finished his coffee. He set the cup on the shelf the way a man does who knows a kitchen well enough to know where things belong. And then he went out into the dark without making a production of it. Elowen sat alone in the cookhouse for another hour, revising her calculations with the smoked venison and the roe ships factored in, and the arithmetic improved considerably. The first real test came on the 5th day. The sky in the northwest had been building for 2 days that particular shade of gray-green that old-timers in Wyoming territory knew to respect. Elowen had noticed it. She had said nothing about it because the weather was not her department, but she had started moving the supply organization in ways that anticipated being stuck indoors. The storm came in the night. By morning it had dropped nearly a foot of snow, and the temperature had fallen hard enough that the water barrel in the cookhouse was frozen solid at the top. The wind was running straight out of the north and hit every gap in every wall like it was looking for something it had lost. Elowen was already in the cookhouse when the first ranch hands came stumbling in from the bunkhouse, faces red, tempers short. "What's for breakfast?" a man named Lester asked, stomping snow from his boots. "Hot oatmeal and coffee," Elowen said. "And if you track snow across my floor, you're cleaning it up yourself." Lester looked at the other men. The other men looked at Lester. The snow got tracked. Nobody offered to clean it. But they also didn't push back on the oatmeal, because the cookhouse was warm and the smell of coffee was already filling the room, and the wind outside was a living thing with teeth. The storm lasted 3 days. On the 2nd day, Harlan called the men together in the barn and the news was bad. 2 sections of the north fence had come down under the weight of snow and drifting. Cattle had scattered into the draws. The supply road was buried. And the temperature showed no sign of rising. One of the older hands, a man named Dutch, started talking about reducing rations. "We don't have enough to feed 15 men through another 2 weeks if the road stays closed," he said. "We cut portions now, we've got a better chance." Several men nodded. Elowen was standing in the doorway of the barn. She had not been invited into this meeting. She had come to return a tool she had borrowed from the tack room. But she heard Dutch's numbers and she stopped walking. "Those numbers are wrong," she said. The barn went quiet. Dutch turned and looked at her. He was a big man, gray-whiskered, 60 if he was a day, and he did not look pleased to be contradicted. "You're the cook," he said. "I am," she said. "And I know exactly what's in that supply room because I inventoried every item in it on my first night here. Your numbers are wrong by about 30%. "How do you figure that?" Dutch said. "Because you're not accounting for the smoked venison in the root cellar under the main house," she said. "Or the roe ships I've been drying since day 3. Or the fact that bean-forward meals require half the preserved meat of meat-forward meals and provide the same caloric value. If we shift the meal plan, we have supplies for 18 days, not 12. The road doesn't need to be open for 18 days. It needs to be open for 10, and the weather will break before that." Dutch stared at her. Several other men stared at her. Harlan, standing near the back wall, said nothing. But he was watching. Then Silas, who had been standing near the far door of the barn the whole time saying nothing, spoke. "She's right," he said. "Let her run the supplies." Dutch looked at Silas. Something passed between them that Elowen couldn't read, but the bigger man's jaw shifted, and he nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's hear the plan." She gave them the plan. She broke it down by day, by meal, by ingredient. She showed them where the cushion was and where it wasn't. She told them what the men could eat in the morning that would carry them through heavy work, and what they could eat at night that would leave them satisfied without burning through the reserves. Nobody interrupted her. When she finished, Dutch said, "You planned all that in your head?" On paper, she said, the papers in the cookhouse. You're welcome to check my arithmetic. Dutch laughed a short, surprised bark of a sound. I'll take your word for it, he said. The storm broke on day 3. The road was passable within the week. Elowen had been right on every count. After that, the men's attitude toward her did not transform overnight. But it shifted. The kind of shift that happens when people have to admit to themselves that their assumption was wrong. They didn't make speeches about it. They didn't apologize. But they stopped talking over her when she was in the room, and that was its own kind of acknowledgement. Silas came to the cookhouse that evening. She had just finished washing the supper dishes when he knocked on the door frame and waited. You could come in, she said. You don't need to knock. It's your kitchen, he said. He came in and poured himself coffee from the pot she always left warm. He sat at the end of the bench. He didn't say anything for a while. You want to tell me something, she said. She was wringing out the dish rag and didn't look at him. I wanted to say the arithmetic was good work, he said. It was basic arithmetic, she said. Anybody could have done it. Anybody didn't, he said. She turned and looked at him. Is that a compliment, Silas Rourke? It's a fact, he said. I don't have the habit of saying things I don't mean. That's a useful habit, she said. She sat down across from him at the work table. How long have you worked this ranch? Something moved through his eyes quick, almost invisible. Long enough, he said. You seem to know it better than anyone else, she said. The root cellar, the row ships. You knew those things the way a man knows a place he's responsible for. Not the way a hired hand knows it. He looked at his coffee cup. I've been here a while, he said. She studied him. Then she decided to let it go. A man who didn't want to explain himself had his reasons, and she had enough to deal with without digging into someone else's business. Well, she said, however long you've been here, thank you for the root cellar. Thank you for the meal plan, he said. He finished his coffee and went back out into the cold night, and Elowen sat alone in the warm cookhouse, listening to the wind that had finally softened. And she thought about the way he had said those words in the barn, she's right, with a certainty that had shut down the argument faster than any volume or anger could have. The next crisis arrived before the first one had fully settled. Elowen had been at Silver Creek for 3 weeks when Gideon Vale came calling. She saw him from the cookhouse window, a big man on a big gray horse, dressed in the kind of clothes that said money loudly enough that you could hear it before he opened his mouth. He had 2 men with him, both of them the kind of men you bring when you want to make a point without quite making a threat. He rode into the yard with the ease of a man who expected to be welcomed. Harlan came out to meet him. A few of the hands drifted in from their work the casual, deliberately unhurried way men drift when they want to look like they just happened to be nearby. Elowen went on cooking, but she moved to the side of the cookhouse window where she could hear. Vale's voice was the kind that carried. He wasn't loud. He simply spoke as if he expected the air to obey him. Harlan, he said, hell of a storm you all came through. Heard you took some losses. We came through fine, Harlan said. Glad to hear it, Vale said. I'm here because I want to do right by my neighbors. I'm prepared to offer supplies, labor, and materials. Fencing, feed, whatever you need, in exchange for a modest arrangement on the western grazing land temporary access, while my own operation extends its range. Harlan said nothing immediately. It's a generous offer, Vale continued. I'm not asking for ownership, just grazing rights. A fair seasonal arrangement. What western land are we talking about? Harlan said. Vale described it a stretch along the creek ridge, 2 miles of it, running from the upper pasture boundary down to where the water came off the hills. Elowen set down the spoon she was holding. She had walked that land. She had walked it specifically because she wanted to understand where the ranch's water came from and how it moved through the property. She had done it because understanding a ranch's water was the same as understanding its survival. That land controlled the creek flow. The creek fed the lower pasture, the cattle pond, and the domestic well. If someone held the grazing rights to that stretch, they could manage or mismanage access to the water. They could graze it out. They could redirect it. They could bring in enough cattle to muddy it. And they could do all of that legally, because rights were rights, and once given they were hard to take back. She walked out of the cookhouse. She did not walk fast. She walked steadily, and she came around the corner of the main house, and she stopped near the group of men, and she said, clearly and without apology, "That land controls the water supply." Vale turned and looked at her. Harlan looked at her. The two men with Vale looked at her the way men look at a woman who has stepped into a conversation she wasn't part of. "I beg your pardon," Vale said. His voice was polite. His eyes were not. "The western ridgeland runs along the headwaters of the creek that feeds this ranch," Elowen said. "The lower pasture, the cattle pond, and the domestic well all depend on that flow. If someone holds grazing rights there and overgrazes it, the ground cover goes. The soil erodes. The creek silts up. Within 2 seasons you've compromised every water source on this property. It's not seasonal grazing rights you're asking for. It's a mechanism to control the ranch's water without paying for the land." Vale stared at her. "Who are you?" he said. "Elowen Mercer," she said. "I'm the cook." "The cook," he repeated. "That's correct," she said. "And I'm telling you that the terms you've described would be catastrophic for this ranch's long-term water security. So Harlan is going to need to hear a different offer. Or he's going to need to decline this one." Gideon Vale was not a man accustomed to being told things by women who were introduced as cooks. His expression had the careful stillness of a man deciding how angry he wanted to be in public. "With respect," he said, "with no respect at all. This is a business conversation between men who understand ranching operations." "Then perhaps," said a voice behind Elowen, "you ought to be having it with someone who understands ranching operations." She didn't turn around. She recognized the voice. Silas stepped forward and stood beside her, not in front of her, not blocking her, but beside her, and he looked at Gideon Vale with the calm, unimpressed expression of a man who was trying to decide if the other man was worth the trouble of being irritated by. "She isn't wrong," Silas said. Vale looked at Silas. At Elowen, at Silas again. "Rourke," he said. Something in his voice had changed. It was very slight, but it was there, Silas said. "You know this woman? She works here," Silas said. "And she's right about the water. The answer is no. If you've got another kind of proposal, Harlan'll hear it. If you don't, you've had a long ride for nothing." Vale held Silas's gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he looked at Elowen once more, a sharp, measuring look that had nothing comfortable in it. "I'll be back," he said. "You're welcome to come back any time," Harlan said pleasantly. "We've got good coffee." Vale turned his horse and rode out. The men around the yard began drifting back to their work. Elowen stood still, watching Vale's retreating back. Silas was quiet beside her for a moment. "You knew about the water," he said. "I walked the land," she said. "Your land. I wanted to understand how it worked." He looked at her sideways. "Why? Because I'm responsible for feeding 15 men," she said. "And I couldn't do that if I didn't understand what kept this ranch alive." He was quiet again. "That sentence," she said. "What you said." "She isn't wrong." That stopped a fight faster than anything else would have. "It was the truth," he said. "I know it was," she said. "But a lot of true things don't get said out loud when they're inconvenient." He looked at her with something in his expression that she couldn't quite name, something attentive and careful, as if he was filing the conversation away in a very specific place. "Thank you," she said, "for standing there." "I didn't do much," he said. "You stood beside me," she said. "That was enough." She went back to the cookhouse. She stood at the work table for a while without moving, her hands flat on the wood, thinking about the way Gideon Vale had looked at Silas when he said the man's name. Not with contempt, not with the casual dismissal he'd used on everyone else. With something more careful, something that looked, if she was honest with herself, like recognition. She thought about what Harlan had said that first day, he lives and works among the men. She thought about the root cellar that Silas knew was there. She thought about the fencing on the north pasture, and the way the other hands moved when he spoke, not the way men move for a senior hand, but the way they move for someone whose word carries the full weight of authority. She thought about Gideon Vale's voice when he said the name Rourke. She thought about all of it, and she decided she didn't know enough yet to know what she was thinking. But she was going to pay attention. That was the thing about Elowen Mercer that most people didn't understand until it was too late. She paid attention to everything, and in a place like Silver Creek Ranch, in a season like this one, attention was the most dangerous thing a woman could possess. The next morning, before anyone else was up, she pulled her coat on over her dress, and she went out in the pale early light, and she walked the western ridge. She walked the full length of it, 2 miles of Headwater Creek, following the ground rise, watching where the water came from the hills and where it moved and where it fed the land below. She took her time. She was cold. She didn't care about the cold. When she got back to the cookhouse and started the breakfast fire, her boots were soaked through and her hands were numb, but she had a very clear picture in her mind of exactly why Gideon Vale wanted that land. And she had a very clear picture of exactly what losing it would mean. She pulled out her paper and she started writing. Not a supply list this time. A land report, property boundaries, water flow, the relationship between the ridgeland and every other water source on the property. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, methodically, completely, without leaving gaps. When Harlan came in for his morning coffee, she slid it across the table to him without a word. He read it standing up, holding his cup, and he read it twice. "When did you do this?" he said. "This morning," she said. "I walked the ridge at first light." He looked up at her. "This is thorough. It's accurate," she said. "Whether it's thorough is for you to decide." Harlan sat down. He spread the paper flat on the table and he read it a third time. "You understand that Vale is going to come back," he said. "I do," she said. "And you understand that when he comes back, he's going to come back harder." "I expect so," she said. "That's why I wrote it down. Whatever happens with Gideon Vale, that document exists now. It says what this ranch's water depends on in plain language with measurements I paced myself. That's harder to dispute than an argument." Harlan looked at her for a long moment. "Silas should see this," he said. She refilled his coffee. "Then show it to him," she said. "He's the one who told me about the root cellar. I'd say he's earned the right to useful information." Harlan folded the paper carefully and put it inside his coat. He finished his coffee. He went out. And Elowen turned back to her stove and her beans and her careful arithmetic, and she thought about the quiet cowboy with the calm eyes who stood beside her when it mattered, and she thought about the look on Gideon Vale's face. And she thought about all the things she still didn't know about Silver Creek Ranch. She thought about all of it while she cooked, and she thought, whatever is happening here, I am going to understand it before it undoes us. She did not yet know how right she was. She did not yet know how much there was left to understand. But she was already in the middle of it, and she was not walking away. Harlan showed Silas the land report that same evening. Elowen knew because Silas came to the cookhouse the following morning before breakfast, earlier than he ever had before, and he stood in the doorway with the folded paper in his hand and he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It wasn't surprise exactly. It was something closer to the look of a man who had suspected something for a long time and had just been handed the proof. "You paced the measurements yourself," he said. "I did," she said. She was cutting salt pork into the bean pot and she didn't stop. "In the dark, at first light," she said. "There was enough to see by." He unfolded the paper and looked at it again, though she was fairly certain he had already read it more than once. "You mapped the relationship between the ridge and the cattle pond." "The relationship was obvious once I walked it," she said. "The creek drops 20 feet in elevation over that 2-mile stretch. Everything downstream depends on what happens upstream. That's not complicated, Silas. That's just water. Most people who work a ranch their whole lives don't think to look at it that way, he said. Most people who work a ranch their whole lives didn't grow up watching their father lose one because a neighbor redirected a creek, she said. He went still. She hadn't planned to say that. It had come out because it was true, and she was tired enough from the early morning walk and the cold and the mental arithmetic that she hadn't put her usual filter on it. Is that what happened? He said quietly. That's what happened, she said. I was 12. We had a good farm. The neighbor upstream put in a mill dam, and the water dropped to nothing by midsummer. My father fought it for 3 years and lost. We had to leave. She pushed the salt pork down into the pot. So yes, I walked your ridge and I wrote down what I saw, because I know exactly what a man like Gideon Vale is planning, and I know exactly how quietly it can happen before anyone realizes what they've lost. Silas was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, he said. About your father. Don't be sorry, she said. Just don't give him the land. I won't, he said. Good. She put the lid on the pot. Breakfast is in 20 minutes. You should wash up. He almost smiled, that fractional near smile she had started to recognize as the warmest expression he regularly produced, and he went out. Elowen stood at the stove with her hand on the lid of the pot and breathed carefully for a moment. She hadn't told anyone that story in years. She wasn't sure what it meant that she'd told him. She decided it didn't mean anything she needed to examine right now. She had biscuits to make. The irrigation channel came to her attention on a Thursday. She had been at Silver Creek for a month by then, and she had developed the habit of walking a different section of the property each time she had an hour free, which wasn't often, but she made the hour when she could. She walked because walking was how she thought, and because understanding the land was the same as understanding the food supply. And because she had learned from her father that a ranch was a living system, and you couldn't manage any part of it without understanding how all the parts connected. She found the channel while walking the north edge of the lower pasture. It was mostly buried caved in along a long section, overgrown with brush and dead grass, but once she saw the shape of it, she could read the whole thing. It had been dug by hand, probably 30 or 40 years back, following the natural contour of the land from the base of the western ridge down toward the lower pasture. Whoever had built it had known what they were doing. They had picked a grade that would move water without eroding the banks. They had lined the steeper section with flat stones. It had been abandoned a long time ago, but it was there. She stood at the base of it and looked up toward the ridge and then down toward the lower pasture, and she did the calculation in her head. If the channel was cleared and the cave-ins were repaired, snowmelt off the western ridge could be redirected directly into the lower pasture during spring runoff. The lower pasture was the weakest grazing section on the ranch, too dry in early spring, too dependent on rain. If you could get reliable water into it from snowmelt, you could bring it into condition 6 weeks earlier. 6 weeks of additional good grazing was not a small thing. She went and found Harlan. He was in the barn checking a horse's hoof, bent over with the hoof between his knees, and she waited until he straightened before she said anything. There's an old irrigation channel along the north edge of the lower pasture, she said. He looked at her. The old Holt ditch. Who's Holt? The man who first settled this land about 40 years back, Harlan said. He started the channel, never finished it before he sold out. It's mostly intact, she said. 3 cave-ins I found, maybe 100 yards of brush clearance needed, and the stone lining on the steep section needs resetting. But the grade is right. If it's cleared, it would bring snowmelt from the ridge into the lower pasture. Harlan set the horse's hoof down and straightened. What would that do for us? It would water the lower pasture from snowmelt, she said. Get it into condition 6 weeks earlier than it is now. That's 6 extra weeks of grazing without moving the herd or buying feed. Harlan was looking at her with that expression she had started to recognize, the one that was half impressed and half unsure what to do with her. You figured all that from one walk. I figured it from 40 years of watching how water moves through land, she said. The walk just showed me this specific channel. He was quiet for a moment. Silas should hear this. I know. Will you bring him, or should I go find him? Harlan brought him. The three of them walked the channel that afternoon, Harlan, Silas, and Elowen moving from the lower pasture up toward the ridge, and Elowen showed them everything she had seen and explained the repairs needed and the grade and the timeline. She had sketched a rough plan on a piece of paper that she passed between them as she talked. Silas listened to all of it without interrupting. He asked 2 questions. Both of them were the right questions, the ones about the stone lining on the steep section, and whether the cave-in nearest the pasture had undermined the bank. The bank's solid, she said. The cave-in was a surface collapse. The underlying soil is firm. How do you know? He asked. I pushed a stick into it, she said. 4 inches in, it stopped. The bank has root structure. It didn't go soft, he nodded. He looked up the line of the old channel and then down toward the pasture. What's the timeline to get it cleared and functional? 2 men working 8 days, she said. Or 4 men working 4 days. I'd rather 4 men and 4 days. The spring runoff won't wait for a slow repair. We've got the men, he said. He looked at Harlan. I can pull 4 off fence rotation, Harlan said. Do it, Silas said. He said it without looking to anyone else for agreement. He just decided it, and the decision was done. Ellen noted that. She filed it carefully in the back of her mind. The work on the channel began the next morning. It did not go smoothly. By day 2, the 4 men working the channel had hit a problem not with the cave-ins, which were manageable, but with the angle at which the channel met the creek at the upper end. Whoever had dug the original channel had made an error in the grade calculation on that last section, and the result was that water entering the channel from the creek would build velocity on the steep section and hit the lower bend too fast. It would jump the bank. The water wouldn't reach the pasture. It would cut a new path through the side of the hill and go wherever gravity took it. Elowen found out when one of the hands, a young man named Carey, came to the cookhouse at midday and told her what they'd found. She put down what she was doing immediately. She walked up to the channel. She looked at the upper section and the angle of approach and the grade on the steep run, and she did the arithmetic in her head 3 different ways because she wanted to be right before she spoke. The men were standing around the upper section looking at it. The mood was the mood of people who have worked hard and discovered the work has led them to a wall. It's the entry angle, she said. We know that, Carey said, not unkindly. We can't change the entry angle. That's where the creek is. You don't change where the creek is, she said. You change where the channel starts. Move the entry point 12 feet upstream. The bank is lower there. You lose 2 feet of elevation at the start, which means the grade on the steep section flattens by enough to slow the water below bank breach velocity. The men looked at each other. That means redigging the first section, one of them said. About 30 feet of it, she said. 2 men 1 day. We'll lose the day we gained from having 4 men. You'll lose a lot more than a day if you channel fast water into the side of that hill, she said. Do it right or don't do it. There was a pause that had the particular quality of men deciding whether to resent the correction or respect it. Then Carey said, she's right. I should have caught that grade problem on day 1. They redug the first section. It took the rest of that day and half of the next. But when they finished and Elowen walked the full length of the channel and looked at the corrected entry angle and the adjusted grade, she knew it was right. The math was in the earth itself, the slope, the curve, the soil, the stone. On the morning of day 6, they redirected a section of the creek into the channel. The water moved. It moved slower than a man could walk, steady and deliberate, following the grade exactly as she had calculated. It reached the lower pasture in just over 2 hours. It spread out into the dry grass and soaked in, and the ground drank it the way thirsty ground does, quickly, without ceremony, as if it had been waiting. The 4 men stood at the pasture edge and watched it. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Dutch, who had been the loudest voice against cutting rations during the storm, the one Elowen had corrected in front of everyone, said, "Well, I'll be damned." Elowen was standing a few feet behind them, and she permitted herself a very small, very private satisfaction. Silas appeared from somewhere behind her. She heard him before she saw him, and he stood beside her, and he looked at the water moving into the pasture, and he was quiet for a moment. 6 weeks, he said. At least 6, she said. If we get a good snowpack on that ridge this winter, could be 8. 8 weeks of additional grazing, he said. That's what I calculated, she said. He turned and looked at her. Not the fractional near smile this time. Something fuller than that. Something that carried weight. This was a good idea, Elowen. She had heard him say her name before. But not quite like that, not with that particular register. Like the word meant more than just the name. It was an old idea, she said. Holt had it 40 years ago. I just finished it. Holt didn't finish it, he said. You did, she looked back at the water. Don't thank me yet, she said. Winter's coming. Let's see how the channel holds. It held, but winter was not done testing them. The second storm came 3 weeks later, and it was worse than the first, not in snowfall but in ice. An ice storm, the kind that comes in fast and quiet and turns everything into glass before anyone has quite processed what's happening. The creek rose inside 2 hours, the cattle pond overflowed. And the water was moving toward the barn. Elowen woke up to the sound of it, not the water itself, but the particular silence after the ice stopped, and then the distant rush that meant the pond had breached. She was out of the cookhouse before most of the hands were awake. She found the barn in the dark, with water already sheeting across the ground toward its south wall. She ran the situation through her head, and she turned and grabbed the first man she found. Coming out of the bunkhouse, a hand named Pete, who had the disoriented look of someone who had dressed in the dark, and she said, "There's an old drainage ditch on the east side of the barn." "Do you know it? The runoff ditch?" Pete said, "Yeah." "Where does it run?" "Down to the lower field, I think." "It's been overgrown for years. Wake up Carrie and one other man," she said. "Get shovels and a pickaxe and meet me at the east corner of the barn." Pete stared at her. "Now, Pete," she said. He went. She went to the east corner of the barn and found the ditch buried under 3 inches of leaf debris and ice. She started clearing it with her hands while she waited. Her fingers went numb within 2 minutes. She kept clearing. Carrie arrived with Pete and another man named Will, all of them carrying tools and wearing expressions of people who were awake, but not yet convinced they understood what was happening. "That ditch," she said, pointing. "We clear it from here down to where it drains. We redirect the overflow from the pond into it before the water hits the barn wall." "In the dark?" Carrie said. "The ice storm's past," she said. "There's enough moonlight. Work by feel where you can't see." She took the pickaxe from Will and drove it into the frozen debris at the head of the ditch. "Start moving." They worked in the cold dark for 40 minutes. The water was already touching the base of the barn wall when the ditch finally opened enough to take flow. Elowen directed them to cut a channel from the pond overflow to the head of the ditch, not a permanent cut, just enough to redirect the immediate surge. The water moved into the ditch. The pressure on the barn wall eased. It was not elegant. It was not planned. It was 3 men with shovels and a woman with a pickaxe and 40 minutes of numb-fingered work in the dark. And it was enough. When Silas arrived, he'd been working the far end of the flooded area. With 4 other men, he came around the corner of the barn and stopped. The water was running down the ditch and away from the barn. He looked at the ditch, at the redirected channel, at Elowen, who was standing in mud and ice with a pickaxe in her hand and no feeling left in her fingers. "How long did this take?" he said. 40 minutes, Carrie said. She had it figured out before the rest of us were awake. Silas looked at Elowen. She put the pickaxe down. "Don't say anything nice," she said. "I'm too cold." He took off his coat. He put it around her shoulders before she could say no. She started to protest, and he said, "Your hands are blue." Don't argue with me about the coat. She didn't argue about the coat. They walked back toward the cookhouse together in the near dark, the ice crunching under their boots, and he walked close enough that she could feel the warmth he was still carrying from physical work, and neither of them said anything. And the silence between them had changed, somehow had become the kind of silence that is comfortable in a way that two people only reach after they have stood in the mud together at 3 a.m. and done something necessary. She made coffee when they got inside. He sat at the bench. She stood at the stove and let the feeling come back into her hands slowly, because that was the only way to do it. You couldn't rush it. The barn is sound, she said. South wall took no water inside, he said. Good. He was quiet for a moment. Then how did you know about the drainage ditch? I walked the east side of the barn my second week here, she said. I was looking for a good place to stack the extra supply crates if the cookhouse storage got full. I noticed the ditch then. It was buried, but the grade was obvious. You filed it away, he said. I file everything away, she said. It's a habit. It saved the barn tonight, he said. Pete and Carrie and Will saved the barn, she said. I just told them where to dig. He looked at her with that careful, weighty look, the one she was starting to understand, meant he was seeing something he didn't want to look away from. Elowen, he said. Don't, she said. I know what you're going to say. What am I going to say? Something about how I'm different from what you expected, she said. Or something about how I don't have to just be the cook. She poured coffee and set a cup in front of him. Don't. I'm exactly what I expected to be. I'm doing my job. I feed this ranch, and I pay attention, and I don't let things go wrong that I can prevent from going wrong. That's the job. He wrapped both hands around the cup. Is that all it is to you, a job? She was quiet for a moment. It's a place where my judgment matters, she said finally. That's not nothing, Silas. I've worked in places where it didn't. Where I could see something clearly and say it plainly, and be told to go back to the kitchen. This is the first place in a long time where what I know has actually been used. He looked at the coffee cup. I'm glad you stayed, he said. I haven't gone anywhere, she said. I know, he said. I'm glad of it. She sat down across from him at the work table. They drank coffee in the warm cookhouse while outside the ice melted, and the dawn came up slow and gray, and it was not a romantic moment in any way that a person might write down in a letter. It was just two tired people in a kitchen after a hard night. But there was something in the room that had not been there before, something that had been built, the way the channel had been built, one careful piece at a time. She noticed it. She didn't name it, but she noticed it. The cattle crisis arrived on a Tuesday. Harlan came to the cookhouse at midday with a face that said something bad had happened before his mouth opened to say it. 3 of the hands had ridden the North Range that morning and come back short. A head count was coming up wrong. Somewhere between 30 and 40 cattle were missing from the north pasture. Lost in the storm? Elowen asked. Could be, Harlan said. But Dutch found tracks. Boot tracks and horse tracks, both in the mud past the north fence line. More horses than we should have out there. She set down her spoon. Boot tracks past the fence line meant riders that weren't Silver Creek riders. Gideon Vale, she said. Harlan said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. How many men does he have working his operation, she said. 8 or 10 regular, Harlan said, but he hires extra during disputes. He's done it before. He's running cattle off the North Range, she said. We don't know that for certain yet, Harlan said. But his voice said he was fairly certain. You need to find them before they cross into Vale's territory, she said. Once they're on his land, he's going to claim they strayed. He'll say his men found them and moved them for safety. By the time the legal dispute gets sorted, he'll have had them branded or sold. Harlan looked at her for a moment. You know about cattle disputes. I know about land disputes, she said. They all work the same way. You move fast or you lose. She didn't know exactly when Silas had come in behind Harlan, but his voice came from the doorway. How many men do we need? 6, Harlan said, and we leave now, not this afternoon. Then we leave now, Silas said. He looked at Elowen briefly, just a look. Nothing spoken in it, or nothing she could read yet, and then he and Harlan went out. Elowen stood in the cookhouse for a moment. Then she started cooking. Because 6 men riding hard in cold weather were going to come back hungry and exhausted, and the job was the job, and that was not a small thing. They were gone 12 hours. They came back after dark with 34 cattle, not all of the missing ones, but most of them. Silas said they had found them 2 miles north of the boundary, being moved by riders who scattered when Silver Creek men appeared. Nobody had been able to identify the riders definitively. The cattle had no new marks on them. Vale's men hadn't had time. Elowen had hot food ready. She fed 6 exhausted men and listened while they talked, and she heard in the way they talked about the riders, the way they described the horses, the gear, the direction they'd scattered certain details that formed a pattern. She waited until most of the men had eaten and drifted back to the bunkhouse before she spoke. Silas was the last one at the table. He was drinking coffee and had the particular stillness of a man who has been moving hard for 12 hours and is only now letting his body understand that it can stop. The riders scattered east, she said. She was washing dishes. They did, he said. But Vale's operation is west of here, she said. It is, so they scattered away from Vale's land, she said. Not toward it. He looked at her. Men who are moving cattle for a neighbor scatter toward the neighbor's land, she said. That's where they have cover and authority. These men went east. Which means either they weren't Vale's men, or they had a reason not to run home. Silas was quiet, she said. Mostly open range, he said. Some small claims, 1 or 2 operations. Who? He thought about it. Man named Pruitt runs a small operation about 8 miles east. He's done work for Vale before. Contract labor. If Pruitt's men were moving your cattle, she said, then Vale can deny he knew anything about it. The cattle stray. Pruitt's men find them, move them to Pruitt's land, sell them through a third party. By the time you trace it back to Vale, there's no paper connecting him. Silas put down his cup. He looked at her with an expression that was neither the near smile nor the careful weighing look, but something else, something harder and more urgent. You just described a very specific plan, he said. I described the plan I would use if I were Gideon Vale, and I wanted Silver Creek's cattle without signing my name to it, she said. Whether that's what happened is for you to determine. He stood up. Harlan needs to hear this tonight, I know, she said. Go find him. He went to the door and then stopped. He turned back. Come with me, he said. She looked up from the dishes. What? Come with me when I talk to Harlan, he said. You should say it yourself. Exactly as you said it to me. She dried her hands on the dish rag. She went. The 3 of them talked in the barn for an hour. Elowen, Silas, Harlan, and the conversation moved fast. The way conversations move when everyone in the room understands the problem clearly and is working toward the same end. Harlan knew Pruitt. He knew 2 of Pruitt's regular hired men by name and description. He said one of them matched the description of a rider Carey had caught a clear look at during the recovery. That's enough to go on, Silas said. Not enough for a legal claim, Harlan said. Enough to know where to look, Silas said. And enough to know that Vale is moving from pressure to action. He looked at Elowen. Which means we're running out of time to be passive about this. What are you planning to do, she said. Protect what's ours, he said. Legally, completely, every record, every brand, every boundary marker. He looked at Harlan. Start tomorrow. I want the brand records audited, the property maps checked against the original survey, and every cattle count documented and witnessed. That's a week of work, Harlan said. Then we start tonight, Silas said. Harlan went to find the records. Silas and Elowen stood alone in the barn for a moment. You know what he's building toward, she said. Yes, he said. He's going to make a legal claim, she said. Something about the boundaries, or the brand records, or the winter losses. He's going to construct a reason to force a sale or a court dispute that drains you before it gets resolved. I know, he said. Do you have the records to fight it? He was quiet for a moment, a beat too long, the kind of pause that means the answer is complicated. We have records, he said. I don't know yet if they're complete. Then we find out, she said. We, he repeated. The single word held a question. I've spent 2 months learning every inch of this operation, she said. I know your supply records, your land, your water, your cattle patterns. If you're going into a records fight, I can help you build the case. Not because it's my job, because I understand what Vale is doing and I don't intend to watch him do it. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Elowen, he said. Don't say something I'm going to have to disagree with, she said. I was going to say thank you, he said. Oh, she said. Then that's fine, he nodded once. He went to help Harlan with the records. She stood in the barn alone for a moment and looked at the cattle, the 34 they had recovered, quiet in their stalls, unaware that they had been the opening move in a game that was far larger than any of them. She thought about Gideon Vale and the way he'd looked at Silas the day she'd confronted him in the yard. She thought about the word Rourke, said in that particular careful voice. She thought about all the things she had been filing away for 2 months. And then she went back to the cookhouse and she started writing. Brand records, supply records, land boundary notes. Cattle counts she had tracked incidentally, because she tracked everything. Water flow assessments, the land report she had already written. Everything she had in her memory and on paper, organized into a form that could be used. She worked until well past midnight. When she finally set her pen down, she had a file of documentation that no one had asked her to build, covering 2 months of careful attention to a ranch she had come to understand better than anyone except its owner. She sat in the quiet cookhouse and looked at what she had made. She still did not know everything about Silver Creek. She still did not know the full truth about Silas Rourke. But she knew that Gideon Vale was coming, and she had just made sure that when he arrived, he would not find them unprepared. Gideon Vale did not come back the next day. He did not come back the day after that either. He made them wait 9 days. Elowen had learned something about men like Gideon Vale in those 9 days, learned it the way you learn a thing by feeling its pressure before you see its shape. He was not a man who acted from anger. He was a man who acted from calculation, and he had let 9 days pass because he wanted them anxious. He wanted them checking the road every morning, watching the horizon, spending energy on waiting that they could have spent on preparing. She refused to give him that. Every morning she cooked. Every afternoon she organized records. Every evening she sat at the work table and cross-referenced brand logs against cattle counts, against supply invoices, building the file she had started the night after the cattle recovery. She did not pace. She did not watch the road. She let the 9 days work for her the way she let everything work for her, methodically, completely, without waste. Silas noticed. He came to the cookhouse on the 4th evening of the wait and stood in the doorway and watched her writing for a moment before he said anything. You're not worried, he said. I'm working, she said. There's a difference. Most people spend waiting time worrying, he said. Most people don't have enough to do, she said. She didn't look up. Are you worried? He came in and poured coffee and sat at the bench. I'm thinking, he said. About what? About what he'll use when he comes, Silas said. Vale doesn't make a move unless he believes it'll hold. He came back the first time with a land offer. He came back the second time with the boundary suggestion. The third time he comes, it'll be with paper, legal paper, she said. Yes. Then we need our paper to be better than his, she said. Do we have enough, he said. She set down her pen and looked at him directly. Tell me something. When was the last time the property boundaries were formally surveyed? He was quiet for a moment. About 8 months ago. Before the winter, she went still. You had the property surveyed 8 months ago? She said. I had reason to believe Vale was positioning to dispute dispute the western boundary, he said. I commissioned a survey before anything came of it. Where are the surveyor's notes, she said. In the file box in the main house study, he said. With the deed records. Silas. Those notes are exactly what we need. If Vale tries to dispute the boundary, a formal survey done 8 months ago kills the argument before it starts. I know, he said. You knew you had them, she said. Yes, and you didn't mention them. He looked at her steadily. I wanted to know what you'd find on your own first, he said. Without the survey. I wanted to know if the records you were building would hold up independently. She looked at him for a long moment. The cookhouse was quiet around them, just the tick of the stove cooling and the distant sound of wind off the ridge. That's a strange reason, she said. It's an honest one, he said. You were testing the records, she said. Or you were testing me. He didn't deny either. She picked up her pen. Bring me the surveyor's notes tomorrow morning, she said. We'll incorporate them into the file. All right, he said. She went back to writing. He drank his coffee, but the air between them had shifted again the way it kept shifting, degree by degree, like a compass needle, moving toward something neither of them had named yet. She was not ready to name it. She had other things to worry about. The surveyor's notes arrived the next morning, and they were exactly what she had hoped for. The survey was precise, detailed, and signed by a licensed county surveyor, whose name she recognized from the deed records as a man of professional standing. It covered every boundary line of Silver Creek Ranch, including the western ridge, with measurements recorded to the foot. She spent that day integrating the survey into the larger file, cross-referencing every boundary measurement against the deed language and against her own paced measurements from the ridge walk. Everything matched. The western boundary was exactly where the deed said it was. The creek ran exactly where the survey said it ran. Gideon Vale's case, whatever it was going to hit a wall. She just didn't know yet exactly what form his case would take. She found out on the 9th morning. She was at the cookhouse stove when she heard horses in the yard, more than one or two, more than a casual visitor. She moved to the window. Vale rode in with 4 men behind him. One of them she did not recognize. He wore a dark coat and carried a satchel and had the bearing of a man who worked in an office, a lawyer, or a county official of some kind. The others were Vale's usual men. Behind them, a 4th man rode a gray horse and carried what looked like a rolled document case across his saddle. Elowen untied her apron. She folded it on the work table. She walked out of the cookhouse. Harlan was already in the yard. Silas came off the porch of the main house a moment later, unhurried, the way a man moves when he's been expecting something and has decided not to show that it matters. Vale dismounted, the man in the dark coat dismounted. The others stayed on their horses. Rourke, Vale said. Pleasant. Easy. The pleasantness of a man who believes he holds the cards. Vale, Silas said. Vale gestured to the man in the dark coat. This is Mr. Aldrin. He's a county land commissioner. Aldrin nodded. He had a careful, neutral face, the face of a man paid to appear impartial. Mr. Aldrin has reviewed several concerns that have been brought to the county's attention regarding Silver Creek Ranch, Vale said. Concerns about property records, cattle ownership documentation, and certain boundary irregularities. What irregularities? Silas said. Not a question. A statement that said he was already done with the framing. Vale smiled. Silas, we can do this pleasantly. I'm not here to make trouble. I'm here because there are legitimate questions about this property's standing after a hard winter, and the county has an interest in making sure things are properly sorted. He paused. I have a proposal that I think will resolve everything cleanly. Let's hear it, Harlan said. Vale nodded to the man with the document case, who unrolled a set of papers and held them out. A purchase offer for the western section of Silver Creek. Fair market value. Clean title transfer. In exchange, I withdraw the concerns I've brought to the county's attention, and Silver Creek continues operating without any legal complications. The yard was quiet. Elowen looked at the papers. She looked at Aldrin's careful, neutral face. She looked at Vale's pleasant, patient expression. She knew exactly what this was. It was not a purchase offer. It was a threat dressed in paper. The concerns brought to the county's attention were the weapon, the legal dispute that would cost more in time and lawyers' fees than the land was worth, dragging on long enough to bleed a ranch that had already been through a brutal winter. The offer was the exit from the threat. Take the money, give up the land, and the problem disappears. And the problem with giving up the land was the same problem she had explained on the very first day Vale had ridden into this yard. The western section controlled the water. "What concerns did you bring to the county?" Elowen said. Vale turned and looked at her. His expression did not change. He had expected her this time, Miss Mercer, he said. "This is a property matter between landowners." "What concerns?" she said again. Aldrin cleared his throat. "There are 3 areas of inquiry," he said in the voice of a man reciting from a prepared list. First, documentation supporting the current western boundary placement, which has been represented to the county as potentially inconsistent with the original land grant. Second, cattle ownership records from the past season, which show discrepancies in brand documentation. Third, financial obligations recorded against the property during the previous ownership transfer. Silas said nothing. Harlan said nothing. Vale smiled again. "Patient. Certain." Elowen said, "Which specific point of the western boundary is being disputed?" Aldrin blinked. It was a small reaction, but she caught it, the reaction of a man who had not expected a specific technical question. "The northwest corner marker," he said, "and its relationship to the creek line." The northwest corner marker was surveyed 8 months ago by Thomas Kellerman of the Weston County Survey Office, she said. The survey placed the marker at precisely the location described in the original deed, 140 yards east of the Upper Creek Bend, following the natural ridgeline. The survey notes are signed, witnessed, and filed. Aldrin looked at Vale. Vale's pleasant expression held, but something behind his eyes moved. "A survey from 8 months ago doesn't resolve a concern about the original deed language," he said. "The deed language places the boundary at the ridgeline," Elowen said. "The survey confirms the ridgeline. The 2 documents are consistent. If there's an inconsistency, it's in the claim you've brought to the county, not in Silver Creek's records." The yard was very quiet. "You're the cook," Vale said. His voice had not changed, but something in it had hardened. "You don't have standing in a property proceeding." "I'm presenting documented facts," she said. "Facts don't require standing." She looked at Aldrin. "The brand discrepancy, which brands are being disputed?" Aldrin hesitated. He looked at his papers. Several head recovered after the winter storms show incomplete brand documentation. "The brand record for every head of Silver Creek cattle has been audited in the past 10 days, she said. "Every animal recovered after the November storm is documented with date of recovery, location found, and brand verification witnessed by 2 ranch employees. If you have a specific animal number, I can tell you which page of the audit record covers it." Aldrin said nothing. Vale said, "Gideon, not a question." A name spoken with warning in it, but he said it to Vale. Not to Elowen. It was the first time the county official had addressed Vale directly, and the tone of it, said something that none of the prepared documents in the satchel could take back. Vale's jaw tightened. Elowen pressed forward. "The financial obligations from the previous ownership transfer, I'd need to see the specific document you're referencing. Silver Creek's current deed shows clear title. If there's a recorded obligation against a previous ownership, it would need to have been filed prior to the current deed date to have legal standing. The deed date is recorded. If you have a document with a filing date prior to that, I'll look at it." Vale said, "You have no legal authority here." "Neither do you," she said. "That's why Mr. Aldrin is here. And Mr. Aldrin looks like a man who's beginning to wonder whether the concerns he's been asked to present are as solid as he was told they were." Aldrin's neutral face had developed a quality that was no longer quite neutral. Mr. Vale, Aldrin said. His voice was careful. Very careful. You represented to the county that these concerns were supported by documentation. They are supported, Vale said. Miss Aldrin looked at Elowen. Mercer, she said. Miss Mercer is describing documentation that, if accurate, would directly address each of the three concerns, Aldrin said. Before we proceed any further, I'm going to need to review Silver Creek's records myself. Vale's pleasant expression was gone. Harlan, Silas said quietly. Harlan said, I'll get the file. He went into the main house. He came back with the file Elowen had built over the past 2 months, the land report, the brand audit, the supply records, the survey notes, all of it organized and cross-referenced and ready. Aldrin took it. He stood in the yard and he read for a long time. His neutral face moved through several expressions that were not neutral at all. Vale stood beside his horse and said nothing. His men sat on their horses and said nothing. The Silver Creek hands had drifted in from their work, Dutch, Carrie, Pete, Will, and 4 others, and they stood at the edges of the yard in the way men stand when they want to be present, without being theatrical about it. Finally, Aldrin looked up. He looked at Vale. These records are complete, he said. The survey is current and properly filed. The brand audit is witnessed and dated. The deed title is clear. He closed the file. I don't see grounds for a county proceeding on any of the 3 concerns. The silence that followed had a texture to it, the thick, particular quality of a silence in which something has just collapsed. Vale said, Aldrin, I came here in good faith based on your representation, Aldrin said. What you represented to me and what I'm looking at are not the same thing. Vale's voice dropped. There's nothing to discuss at present, Aldrin said. He looked at Silas. I apologize for the intrusion, Mr. Rourke. Silver Creek's records appear to be in order. The county has no basis for further inquiry. He handed the file back to Harlan. He got on his horse. He rode out without looking at Vale again. Vale stood in the yard. His 4 men were still on their horses, and the horses had the look of horses that feel the tension in the air without understanding its source. Vale looked at Silas. Then he looked at Elowen, and the look he gave her was not anger exactly. It was something colder than anger and more dangerous, the look of a man who has just recalibrated how much of a problem she is. You've got good records, Vale said. We do, Silas said. Records can be disputed, Vale said. Courts take time. Money, patience. They do, Silas said. You're welcome to try. Vale looked at him for a long moment. Then he smiled, a different smile than the pleasant one from before. A smile that was a message. This isn't finished, he said. Most things aren't, Silas said. Vale mounted his horse. He rode out. The yard stood still until the sound of hooves had faded. Then Dutch let out a long, slow breath that was almost a laugh. Well, he said, that was something. Carrie looked at Elowen. You memorized the survey measurements? I don't memorize things, she said. I remember things I've written down. There's a difference. What's the difference? Memorizing is effort, she said. Remembering is what happens when you pay attention. The men drifted back to their work. Harlan stood holding the file. He looked at it, then at Elowen, then at Silas. This is the file she built, he said to Silas. 2 months of documentation, I know, Silas said. She built it before she knew we'd need it, Harlan said. I know that too, Silas said. Harlan handed the file back to Elowen. He nodded once the way Harlan nodded when he had said everything he intended to say and walked to the barn. Elowen held the file against her chest. Silas looked at her. You didn't tell me you'd memorized the survey measurements, he said. I told you I read the survey notes, she said. There's a difference between reading and being able to cite specific figures under pressure in a yard full of people, he said. Not much of one, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The yard was quiet around them. The morning light had gone long and golden, the way it does in late autumn when the sun stays low. Elowen, he said. I know, she said. Don't say it. I'm going to say it, he said. She waited. You just did something that most lawyers I've met couldn't have done as cleanly, he said. And you did it because you spent 2 months paying attention to a ranch you were hired to feed. Not because anyone asked you to. Not because there was anything in it for you. She looked at the file in her hands. There was something in it for me, she said. I told you before. This is the first place in a long time where what I know gets used. I wasn't going to let Gideon Vale take that. You were protecting the ranch, he said. I was protecting something that matters, she said. That's all. He was quiet. Then he said, come to the main house this evening. There's something I need to show you. She looked up. What? Just come, he said. He walked toward the barn. She watched him go with a feeling she couldn't entirely name, part suspicion, part something warmer, part the particular unease of knowing that a conversation is coming that will change the shape of things. She went back to the cookhouse. She put the file on the shelf. She started the lunch fire. She told herself she was not thinking about the evening. She thought about it all afternoon. The main house was warmer than she expected, a good fire going, 2 oil lamps lit. The desk in the study cleared except for a single wooden box that sat centered on it like something placed with intention. Harlan was not there. Nobody was there except Silas, who stood near the desk and gestured to the chair across from it when she came in. She sat. He did not sit. He stood beside the desk with his hand resting on the wooden box, and he looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, not the near smile, not the careful waiting look, not the urgent focus of the crisis moments. Something quieter than all of those. Something that made her feel, for no reason she could immediately account for, that whatever was in that box was going to be important. I want to tell you something, he said. All right, she said. I should have told you before, he said. I made a decision when you arrived not to, and I believe it was the right decision at the time. I'm less certain it was the right decision overall. She folded her hands in her lap. Just say it, Silas. He opened the box. Was a deed. A land deed. She could see enough of the document to read the property name, Silver Creek Ranch, Wyoming Territory, and the name of the owner on the signature line. Silas Rourke. She looked at the deed. She looked at him. She looked at the deed again. The room was very quiet. You own it, she said. Yes, he said. You own Silver Creek Ranch, she said. All of it, he said. I have since I bought it from Holt's estate 6 years ago. She did not say anything. He put the deed back in the box. The men knew. Harlan knew. The few people in town who needed to know, the lawyer, the bank, the county surveyor, they knew. I made a decision when I took over the ranch to work it the way my father worked it. Alongside the men. Not above them. I wanted to know my own operation from the ground up, and I wanted the men to know me the same way. Not as an owner. As a man who pulled the same weight they pulled. She was still looking at the box. You let me believe you were a ranch hand, she said. I let you form your own impression, he said. I didn't correct it when you did. That's the same thing. It isn't exactly, he said. But I understand why it feels that way. She stood up. She was not angry, or she was angry, but the anger was not the hot kind. It was the cold, careful kind that comes when something you trusted turns out to have a room in it you didn't know was there. I worked beside you, she said. I told you about my father. I told you about the farm we lost. I trusted you with that. I know, he said. And the whole time you were. She stopped. She pressed her lips together. You were what? Testing me? Seeing if the cook would behave herself if she didn't know the owner was watching? No, he said, that is not what I was doing. Then what were you doing? He was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved against the house. I was trying to know someone honestly, he said. Before money got between us. Before position got between us. I've hired people who knew I owned this place. I watched them behave entirely differently than they would have otherwise, overly careful, overly agreeable, working to impress rather than to do the actual work. I wanted to know what you were like when you didn't know it mattered. She stood very still. "You watch me work," she said. "I worked beside you," he said. "There's a difference." "And what did you see?" He looked at her steadily. "I saw someone who did the job better than anyone I'd ever hired for it. I saw someone who walked the land at 5 in the morning because she wanted to understand it. I saw someone who stood in front of Gideon Vale on her third week here and told him the truth because it needed to be said, regardless of whether anyone was going to back her up." He paused. "And then I backed her up, because she was right, and because I would have been a coward not to." She turned away from him. She walked to the window. She stood with her back to the room, looking out at the dark. "I didn't need you to be wealthy," she said. "That is not what I was looking for when I came here." "I know," he said. "I needed you to be honest," she said. "You're right," he said. "I needed the man working beside me to be the same man I thought he was." "He is," Silas said. "That part was never a performance. I am who you thought I was. I'm also the man whose name is on the deed." "Both of those things are true." She was quiet for a long time. The fire burned. The lamps held their light. "Why tonight?" she said finally. "Why tell me now?" "Because you just stood in my yard and defended this ranch with 2 months of work. Nobody asked you to do," he said. "Because you know this property better than most of my hands do. Because Vale is going to come back, and when he does, I want you to know everything. I want you to fight this with the whole picture, not half of it." She turned around. She looked at him. "And because," he said, more quietly, "it stopped being right a while ago. Keeping it from you. It stopped being about protecting something honest and started being about—" He stopped. "About what?" she said. "About not wanting to change what we were," he said. "In the evenings. In the cookhouse. The way you'd talk to me when I was just Silas who fixed fence and drank your coffee and knew where the root cellar was." She looked at him for a long time. The thing she had noticed but not named, the thing that had been building degree by degree, the way the irrigation channel had been built. One piece at a time, it had a name now. She knew what it was. She was not going to say it tonight. "I need time to think about this," she said. "I know," he said. "You don't get to rush me because you feel guilty," she said. "I wouldn't dare," he said. She went to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame, and she said, without turning around, "The file is still on the shelf in the cookhouse. The survey notes are on top. Whatever Vale brings next, the answer is in that file." "I know it is," he said. She went out into the cold. She walked back to the cookhouse, and she stood inside with the door closed and the fire banked low, and she held the thing she was feeling at arm's length and looked at it. Betrayal. Not the sharp kind, not the kind that comes from malice. The dull, aching kind that comes from discovering that someone you trusted had a room inside them you were not allowed into. That the man who had stood beside her in the yard and said she isn't right, who had known about the root cellar and the row ships, and had sat with her in the kitchen at 3 in the morning while the ice melted off the barn, that man had also been. The entire time, the man who owned everything around her. She understood his reasons. She even understood why they had seemed reasonable to him. That didn't make it easier. She sat down at the work table. She put her hands flat on the wood. She breathed. Then she pulled the file off the shelf. Because Gideon Vale was going to come back, and she was not going to let feelings she hadn't sorted out yet make her slow. The file was ready. The records were ready. Whatever Vale brought next, she would be ready. She was still at the table at midnight when she heard it, the distant sound of a horse, moving fast, coming in from the north road. Not a casual ride, not a man coming home late, a horse being pushed. She went to the door and opened it. Carrie came into the yard at a hard canter and pulled up and was off his horse almost before it stopped. He'd been riding the north fence line. What happened? Harlan called from the bunkhouse doorway, where the sound had woken him. "You need to see this," Carrie said. His voice was tight. "Somebody's been through the north boundary markers." 3 of them. Moved, the yard went still. Elowen stood in the cookhouse doorway. "Moved boundary markers." If the markers had been moved and Vale had a surveyor ready to record the new positions, and he filed that survey before anyone could dispute it, the legal battle Aldrin had refused to start that morning could be restarted on entirely different grounds, with manufactured evidence in place of the real boundary. She moved, she grabbed the file, she grabbed her coat. She walked fast across the yard to where Harlan and Carrie were standing, and she said, "Which markers?" "Northwest corner and the two south of it," Carrie said. "Along the ridge line. Exactly the boundary Vale had been targeting since the first day." "We need to document the original positions tonight," she said. "Before morning. Before anyone else comes near that land." Harlan looked at her. "The survey notes have the measurements," she said. "I have them. If we ride up there now with lanterns and witnesses and record where the markers should be versus where they've been moved, we have proof of tampering. If we wait until morning, he'll have a surveyor out there at first light," Harlan said. He said it like a man who had just understood the full scope of what was happening. "Yes," she said. The main house door opened. Silas came out. He had heard enough. He looked at Elowen, at the file in her hands, at her face. "How many men do we need?" he said. "4," she said. "2 to ride with us, 2 to stay here in case anyone comes to the yard while we're gone." "Lanterns?" "3," she said. "And bring something to write with." He was already moving, and in that moment in the cold dark yard with the file under her arm and Silas already calling for horses and Harlan pulling on his coat, Elowen understood something she had not fully understood before. This was not about a job anymore. This had not been about a job for a long time. She was fighting for Silver Creek the way a person fights for something that belongs to them. And Gideon Vale was not going to take it. They rode out in the dark with 3 lanterns, between 5 of them Silas, Harlan, Carrie, a hand named Will, and Elowen, who had never in her life ridden to a property boundary at midnight with a file of legal documents under her arm, and had decided that this was simply the kind of night it was going to be. The file was wrapped in oilcloth against the cold. She held it against her body under her coat and rode with one hand and told herself the ground was steady and the horse knew its job, and she only needed to stay in the saddle long enough to get there. Carrie led them north at a pace that was fast enough to mean business and careful enough that nobody broke a leg in the dark. They reached the northwest corner marker in under 30 minutes. Harlan held a lantern low to the ground and they all looked. The marker was a square-cut post, about 2 feet high, driven into the earth at the corner point, where the ridgeline boundary met the upper fence line. Or it had been. Someone had dug it out carefully, with tools not yanked up in a hurry, and reset it approximately 8 feet to the east. You could see where it had been. The original hole was still there, edges clean, filled loosely with disturbed soil that hadn't settled yet. 8 feet. That was all. But 8 feet at the northwest corner, carried consistently to the 2 markers south of it, shifted the entire western boundary line inward enough to put the headwaters of the creek outside Silver Creek's property. Not by accident, by precise, deliberate intention. "He had a surveyor out here," Silas said. His voice was flat and cold. "Had to," Harlan said. "You don't move markers by 8 feet exactly without measuring first." "He moved them today," Elowen said. She was kneeling by the original hole, looking at the soil. "The disturbed earth hasn't frozen yet. He did this after Aldrin left. After the county proceeding fell apart. He lost the paper argument, so he manufactured new evidence," Silas said. "And he'll have a surveyor here at first light to record the new positions," she said. "If that survey gets filed before we can challenge it, the legal dispute starts from his manufactured baseline, not from the real one." She opened the file. She found the survey notes. She handed one lantern to Will and asked him to hold it close and steady, and then she started reading measurements aloud, while Harlan wrote them down, the true positions of all 3 markers. Exactly as Thomas Kellerman had recorded them 8 months ago, with reference points that were fixed and unmovable: a granite outcrop to the north, a creek bend to the west, a mapped fence junction to the south. They worked in the cold for 40 minutes, documenting everything. The original marker holes, the moved positions, the precise displacement. The condition of the disturbed soil, the reference points that confirmed where the markers were supposed to be. Carrie found boot prints in the mud near the second marker. Multiple sets, at least 3 men. Can we reset the markers tonight? Will asked. No, Elowen said immediately. If we move them back tonight, Vale's going to claim we're the ones who tampered with them. We need the tampering on record exactly as it is. Witnesses and documentation, then the legal challenge. Silas looked at her. She's right. We leave them where Vale put them, and we go to the county in the morning with what we have. He's going to get there first, Harlan said. Not if we ride tonight, Silas said. They finished the documentation. Elowen's handwriting was steady despite the cold and the lantern light, and the fact that her fingers had gone numb twice, and she had pressed them against her coat each time until the feeling came back. She wrote everything down. She missed nothing. When they rode back, she sat straight in the saddle with the file under her coat and the wind coming off the ridge, and she thought about Gideon Vale sitting somewhere comfortable right now, warm and certain, believing he had reset the board. She thought, you do not know what you are dealing with. They reached the ranch house at just past 2 in the morning. Silas took the file from her before she could protest and said, Go inside. Get warm. I need to talk to Harlan. I should be part of that conversation, she said. You will be, he said, in 10 minutes. I need 5 words with Harlan first. She went inside. She stood at the main house fireplace and pressed her numb hands close to the heat and listened to the murmur of their voices outside and did not try to hear the words. Whatever those 5 words were, they were between the two of them, and she could wait 10 minutes. She was thinking about Aldrin, the county land commissioner, who had ridden out that morning with his careful neutral face and his borrowed authority. He had looked at the records, found them sound, and withdrawn. But he had also arrived in the first place based on Vale's representations, which meant he was either Vale's man or he was a legitimate official who had been used by Vale. If he was legitimate, he might be an ally. If he was Vale's man, he was already warning Vale about the documentation they had shown him today, and Vale's surveyors would arrive at the northwest marker by 6 in the morning. She needed to know which one. Silas came in. 5 words, she said. I told Harlan to send a rider to Kellerman tonight, he said. The surveyor. I want him at the county clerk's office when it opens, with a certified copy of his original survey notes and a sworn statement about the marker positions he recorded. That gets filed before Vale's manufactured survey gets anywhere near a clerk. She looked at him. That was more than 5 words. The 5 words were get Kellerman there first, he said. She almost smiled. She stopped herself. She was not ready to smile at him yet. Aldrin, she said. I know, he said. He sat down near the fire. I've been thinking about him since this morning. Is he Vale's man? I don't believe so, Silas said. I've known Aldrin's name for years. He has a reputation for being particular about procedure. What I think happened is Vale told him a version of the truth that was convincing enough to get him out here with official authority, and when the records didn't support the version, Aldrin backed off. Which means he's embarrassed, she said. Yes. And a man who's been made to look like he carried water for a land fraud scheme is either going to go quiet and hope it goes away, or he's going to be very interested in seeing the person who used him face a consequence, she said. Silas looked at her. You're thinking about going to Aldrin. I'm thinking that a county land commissioner who has already seen Silver Creek's records and found them sound, who has already been presented with Vale's claims and found them unsupported, is going to be a very credible witness if this goes to a formal hearing, she said. And I'm thinking that if we bring him evidence of boundary marker tampering before Vale has a chance to spin another version of events, we are not asking him to take our side. We are giving him the chance to be the official who stopped a fraud rather than the one who nearly enabled it. The fire crackled. Silas was quiet for a long moment. You want to go tonight, he said. I want to go at first light, she said. With the documentation. to Aldrin's office before Vale's surveyor gets to the county clerk. He looked at the file on the table between them. Then he looked at her. She held his gaze. She was not going to look away first. "All right," he said. They left at 4:30 in the morning. Silas, Elowen, and Harlan with the full documentation file, the survey notes, the witness statements Elowen had drafted by hand before she allowed herself an hour of sleep on the main house settee, and a determination that felt in Elowen's chest like a second heartbeat, steady and insistent. The county seat was 2 hours' ride. They arrived at Aldrin's office at 6:45, 15 minutes before the county offices officially opened. Aldrin was already there. He was the kind of official who came in early, which told Elowen something useful about him. He looked up when they came in, and his expression did the complicated thing that expressions do when a man is surprised and trying not to show it, and already thinking 3 steps ahead simultaneously. "Mr. Rourke," he said, "Miss Mercer." He looked at Harlan. "Mr. Creed, Mr. Aldrin," Silas said. "Thank you for seeing us early." "I haven't officially agreed to see you," Aldrin said. But he didn't tell them to leave. Elowen put the file on his desk. She opened it to the section on the boundary markers, and she turned it so he could read it without picking it up, and she said, "Gideon Vale's men moved 3 boundary markers on the northwest boundary of Silver Creek last night. After your visit, after you found our records sound and withdrew the county inquiry." Aldrin looked at the file. He looked at the documentation she had written by lantern light in the cold. He looked at the reference measurements against Kellerman's original survey. He looked at the witness statements signed by Silas, Harlan, Carey, and Will, with the time and conditions of observation recorded. "You documented this at the scene," he said. "Last night," she said. "Within 2 hours of the tampering being discovered. The soil in the original marker holes hadn't frozen yet. The displacement is 8 feet due east on all 3 markers, precisely enough to move the creek headwaters outside Silver Creek's legal boundary." Aldrin sat back. "He's going to bring you a survey this morning," Elowen said. "Recorded from the new marker positions. He's going to ask you to open a new county inquiry based on a boundary discrepancy between his fresh survey and the existing deed." Aldrin said nothing. "What we're asking you to do," she said, "is look at what's already on this desk before you look at anything Vale brings you. That's all. Look at the sequence of events. Look at the timing. Look at the precision of the displacement, and ask yourself whether 3 boundary markers move 8 feet in exactly the direction by coincidence, the night after a county inquiry into this property's records is withdrawn." Aldrin looked at her for a long moment. "You're asking me to treat this as evidence of fraud," he said. "I'm asking you to treat it as evidence," she said. "What it's evidence of is for you to determine." Aldrin picked up the file. He read it properly, this time carefully, from the beginning, not skimming. He turned pages slowly. He stopped at the witness statements and read each one twice. When he finished, he set it down. "I need Kellerman's certified survey notes," he said. "They're being filed at the county clerk's office this morning," Silas said. "By Kellerman himself. I sent a rider last night." Aldrin looked at Silas with an expression that was something close to respect, though he was too professional to let it fully form. "You anticipated this." "She anticipated it," Silas said. He didn't gesture toward Elowen. He didn't need to. Aldrin looked at her. "Miss Mercer," he said, "what is your official role at Silver Creek Ranch?" "Cook," she said. Something crossed his face. Not quite amusement. Not quite admiration. "Something in between," he said. He stood up. "I'm going to need you to wait here while I go to the clerk's office," he said. "If Kellerman's notes are filed as you say, and if the displacement you've documented is consistent with what the certified survey shows, then we have a different situation than the one I was presented with yesterday." "A significantly different situation," Elowen said. "Yes," Aldrin said, "significantly." He put on his coat and went out. They waited and sat. Silas stood near the window. Elowen sat at the desk with the file in front of her and went through it one more time, looking for anything she might have missed, Any gap Vale could use, any weakness in the chain of evidence. She found none. She sat back. "You should eat something," Silas said without turning from the window. "I'm fine," she said. "You've been awake since yesterday morning," he said. "So have you," she said. "I'm not the one who witnessed documentation by lantern light," he said. She looked at her hands. Her fingers were still faintly red from the cold of the previous night. She hadn't noticed until now. "Silas," she said. He turned. "When this is over," she said, "I want to talk about what you told me last night." "About the deed," he said. "About all of it," she said. He held her gaze. "All right," he said. "Not now," she said. "When this is over." "Understood," he said. He turned back to the window. The door opened 40 minutes later. Aldrin came back in, and behind him was Thomas Kellerman himself, a compact, precise man in his 50s who carried his own document case and wore the expression of a professional whose reputation was currently very much on the line. "Mr. Kellerman's notes are filed," Aldrin said. "I've reviewed them against the displacement measurements in your documentation." He stopped in the middle of the room. The 3 markers were moved from their surveyed positions by 8 feet 2 inches east, he said. On all 3, consistently, to within a quarter inch of each other. He let that sit for a moment. "That level of consistency does not happen by accident," he said. "And it does not happen without a surveyor's equipment." "No," Elowen said, "it doesn't. Gideon Vale arrived at the county clerk's office 40 minutes ago," Aldrin said. "With a survey, conducted this morning at first light, documenting the current marker positions. The room was very still." "He was there when you were there," Harlan said. "Yes," Aldrin said. "What happened?" Silas said. Aldrin looked at him steadily. "The clerk declined to file the survey pending review of a prior filing that had been submitted earlier this morning." He paused. "By Mr. Kellerman." Kellerman straightened slightly. "Vale's survey has no legal standing until the discrepancy between his recorded positions and the certified positions in the prior filing is resolved," Aldrin said. "That resolution will require a formal hearing, which you'll oversee," Elowen said. "Which will be overseen by the county," Aldrin said carefully. "But yes, given my involvement yesterday, I am prepared to provide a full account of both visits to Silver Creek Ranch and the documentation I reviewed on each occasion, including the fact that the records were sound when you left yesterday," she said. "Including that fact," he said. Vale's legal mechanism had just jammed. Not collapsed, not yet, but jammed. They rode back to Silver Creek in the late morning, and Elowen sat in the saddle with the cold air on her face and the particular exhaustion of a body that has been running on determination for 24 hours and is starting to feel the cost of it. Silas rode beside her. "Not ahead, beside. He's going to get a lawyer," she said. "He already has one," Silas said. "Are you going to get one?" "I already have one," he said, "in Laramie. I sent word this morning before we left." She looked at him. "When did you send word?" "When Harlan woke me up with Carey's report," he said. "I wrote a letter and gave it to Pete to carry. It went out before we rode to the markers." She was quiet. "You had a plan the whole time," she said. "I had a direction," he said. "You had the plan." She shook her head slightly. "I'm serious," he said. "The file, the documentation. Going to Aldrin before Vale got there. Those were your decisions." "You supported them," she said. "Everyone," he said. Without hesitation, she looked at the road ahead. "That's going to matter at the hearing," she said. "Vale is going to argue that Silver Creek's records were constructed retroactively, that we built the file to counter his claims." "The survey is 8 months old," Silas said. "Filed and signed by Kellerman before any of this started." "I know," she said. "But he'll argue the other records, the brand audit, the boundary documentation, the witness statements were assembled after the fact." "Were they? Some of them," she said. "Yes. The brand audit I did in the last 10 days. The witness statements I wrote last night. That's honest," he said. "It won't sound honest when Vale's lawyer frames it," she said. He'll make it sound like we built a defense after we knew we needed one. Silas thought about it. What do we need? We need something that existed before I started building the file, she said. Something with a date on it that I couldn't have manufactured. Something from the early weeks before Vale's first visit. She thought about it, and then she remembered. The supply inventory, she said. He looked at her. My first night at Silver Creek, she said. I wrote a full supply inventory, every item in the supply room with quantity and condition. I dated it. I put it in the file Harlan keeps for supply orders. If that document is still there, and it should be, because supply records are kept for accounting purposes, it proves that I was documenting this ranch from my very first night. Not in response to Vale, before Vale ever appeared. Silas stared at her. You've been building a record of this ranch since your first night, he said. It's what I do, she said. I don't know how to be in a place without understanding it completely. I inventory everything. I write everything down. Because of your father, he said quietly. Because of my father, she said. He was quiet for a long moment. When we get back, he said, I want to look at that supply inventory. It'll be in Harlan's file box, she said, second shelf left side. Of course you know where it is, he said. There was something in his voice, something warm and weighted and rough around the edges. The way something real is always rough around the edges, compared to something performed. She didn't respond to it, but she felt it. The hearing was set for 11 days later. Those 11 days were the strangest of Elowen's time at Silver Creek, stranger than the storms, stranger than the cattle recovery, stranger even than the night at the boundary markers. Because the external pressure had reached a kind of plateau before the hearing, and in that plateau she and Silas existed in the main house and the cookhouse and the spaces between. And the conversation she had promised to have when it was over had not happened yet, but its weight was present in every room they shared. He was careful with her, not distant careful. The difference between a man avoiding a conversation and a man giving a woman the space she said she needed. She noticed the difference. She appreciated it more than she knew how to say. On the 5th day, she came into the main house study to retrieve a document from the file and found him at the desk writing letters. He didn't look up immediately when she came in. There's coffee in the kitchen, she said. I just made it. Thank you, he said. She found her document. She was almost to the door when he said, without looking up from his letter, I should have told you on your 2nd week. She stopped. Maybe your 3rd, he said. When I saw how you walked the ridge. When you came back with the water report, he set the pen down. I knew by then that it wasn't a test anymore, that you were just that. She turned around. Just that, she said. Exactly what you appeared to be, he said. Which nobody ever is, in my experience. Most people are performing something. You were just working. She leaned against the doorframe. You perform too, she said. The quiet cowboy who fixes fence. That's a performance. It's also the truth, he said. I do fix fence. I do work with the men. I'm not pretending to be something I'm not. You're leaving out the part where you own everything, she said. Yes, he said, I was leaving that out. She looked at him. I'm still angry about it, she said. I know, he said. I'm less angry than I was, she said. He looked up at her properly then. The careful, weighted look. But underneath it, something less guarded than usual. That's something, he said. Don't push it, she said. I won't, he said. She went back to the cookhouse. She stood at the stove and thought about the way he'd said just that, the simplicity of it, the weight of it, the way it was the most honest thing he'd said to her since the night in the study when he'd shown her the deed. She was still thinking about it when Harlan came in with news that Vale's lawyer had submitted a motion to expedite the hearing. He wanted it moved up 4 days. Why, she said. He wants it before Kellerman can be formally deposed, Harlan said. She set down her spoon. Kellerman's deposition is scheduled for Thursday, she said. Vale's lawyer filed to have the hearing moved to Tuesday, Harlan said. He can't exclude Kellerman's deposition if it's already on record, she said. The timing only matters if he believes he can get a ruling before Kellerman's sworn testimony is entered. Can he do that? Harlan said. Not if we object to the motion tonight, she said. She was already walking to the study. Silas looked up when she came in. Vale's lawyer filed to move the hearing to Tuesday, she said. We need to send word to your lawyer in Laramie tonight. He needs to file an objection on the grounds that it would exclude a material witness's sworn deposition from the record. Silas was on his feet before she finished the sentence. The objection went out that night by the fastest rider Harlan had. It arrived in Laramie the next morning, the hearing date held at 11 days. Kellerman was deposed on Thursday. His testimony was entered into the record on Friday. And on the morning of the hearing, Elowen sat in the county building in her best dress, which was not a particularly fine dress. But it was clean and pressed, and she wore it with the straightness of a woman who has decided exactly who she is and requires no costume to prove it, with the full file on the table in front of her and a clarity in her chest that felt like the moment just before the water had finally moved down the irrigation channel. Steady, inevitable, right. Vale's lawyer was a sharp man named Greer who had a quick tongue and a talent for making straightforward things sound complicated. He presented Vale's survey first. He described the boundary discrepancy with authority and technical vocabulary. He characterized Silver Creek's records as recently assembled and potentially self-serving. Then it was Silas's lawyer's turn. He called Kellerman. Kellerman testified for 40 minutes. He described the original survey in precise technical detail. He described the marker positions as he had recorded them. He described how those positions differed from the position in Vale's survey by 8 feet, 2 inches east, consistently, on all 3 markers. Greer cross-examined him. It did not go well for Greer. Kellerman was a man who measured things for a living and did not accept imprecision from anyone, including lawyers who were trying to suggest his measurements might be approximate. Then Silas's lawyer called Ellen. Greer objected. He called her testimony irrelevant. He called her a cook with no legal standing. The presiding official overruled him. She was a witness to the tampering. She had standing as a witness. She sat in the chair. She held the file on her lap. She was not nervous. She had written the contents of this file. She had built it piece by piece over 2 months. She knew every word in it, the way she knew every item on the supply shelf exactly, completely, without hesitation. Silas's lawyer took her through it methodically. The supply inventory from her first night. The land report from her early morning walk. The brand audit. The boundary documentation. The witness statements from the night at the markers. She answered every question directly and without elaboration, because she had learned from her father's legal fight that courts do not like elaboration. They like facts. She gave them facts. Greer cross-examined her. He started with her role. You're employed at Silver Creek Ranch as a cook. Yes, she said, not as a land surveyor, not as a legal clerk. Not as a property manager. No, she said. So the documentation you've presented was assembled by a cook, he said. With no formal training in land records, property law, or surveying. The documentation was assembled by a person who can read, write, count, and pay attention, she said. If those skills require a professional credential, I wasn't aware of it. A few people in the room made sounds they tried to swallow. Greer moved on. He tried to suggest the brand audit had been assembled specifically to counter Vale's claims. She showed him the supply inventory dated her first night. She showed him that the methodology in the brand audit was identical to the methodology in the supply inventory, that she documented things consistently, not reactively, because that was how she worked. He tried to suggest the witness statements from the boundary marker night were coordinated. She pointed out that each statement described the same physical evidence, the marker positions, the original holes, the soil condition, from the perspective of where each witness was standing. The statements were consistent because the facts were consistent. He tried to suggest that the documentation of the tampering had been produced after the fact. She showed him the timestamps. She showed him the witness signatures with the time of signing recorded by each witness themselves. Greer sat down. He was not a man who showed frustration openly. But his stillness had the quality of a man who has run into a wall and is deciding whether to keep running. The presiding official reviewed the full file. He reviewed Kellerman's survey and the displacement measurements. He reviewed Aldrin's written account of both visits to Silver Creek, which Aldrin had submitted without being asked, and which described finding Silver Creek's records complete and sound, and then arriving to find Vale's survey claiming positions that directly contradicted those records. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said that the evidence of boundary marker displacement was sufficient to constitute a finding of tampering with legally recorded survey markers, which was a criminal matter, not a civil one, and would be referred to the county sheriff's office for investigation. He said that Silver Creek's western boundary, as established by the prior filed survey and confirmed by the original deed, remained the legal boundary of record. He said that Vale's survey was inadmissible as a basis for any property claim, as it had been conducted from positions that were themselves the subject of a tampering finding. He said the matter before the county was resolved in favor of Silver Creek Ranch. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then it was not quiet. Greer immediately began speaking in Vale's ear. Vale sat very still with the expression of a man doing the calculation of what this meant and not finding the answer comfortable. Silas sat beside his lawyer with his hands flat on the table and looked at nothing for a moment, the look of a man who has been holding something up for a very long time and has just been told he can set it down. Elowen sat in the witness chair with the file on her lap. She breathed. She thought about her father, about the farm, about the summer the water dropped and the 3 years of fighting and the leaving. She thought this one held. Someone touched her arm. Harlan, who had been sitting in the row behind her. He said nothing. He just put his hand on her arm for a moment and nodded. She nodded back. She looked across the room at Gideon Vale. He was looking at her. His expression had changed from the cold calculation of the man who had looked at her in the yard outside Silver Creek. Something had gone out of it. Not defeat. Men like Vale did not show defeat in public. But the certainty was gone. The thing that said he knew how this ended. He didn't know how this ended anymore. She looked away first. Not because she was unsettled, because she had nothing more to say to him with her eyes that the file hadn't already said better. Outside the building in the cold bright air, Silas stood beside her, and Harlan went to get the horses, and the sound of the county seat, going about its ordinary business, moved around them. "It's not over," she said. "No," he said. "He'll find another angle," she said. "Men like that don't stop because they lose one hearing." "I know," he said, "but he lost this one, and now there's a sheriff's investigation into the marker tampering. That changes his calculus. It limits him," she said. Yes, she looked at the street. People moving, horses, the ordinary sounds of a Wednesday morning in a small county seat. "Your lawyer was good," she said. "He used your file," Silas said. "Largely verbatim. He told me afterward that he's never walked into a hearing with documentation that complete from a lay witness." "Tell him it was assembled by a cook," she said. "I did," Silas said. "He said he'd hire you away from me if you were interested." She looked at him. He was almost smiling, fuller than the fractional near smile. "Almost all the way there. The conversation," she said. His expression settled into something serious and attentive. "Tonight," she said. "When we're back. I'm ready to have it." He nodded once. Slow. "I'll be there," he said. Harlan came around with the horses. They rode back to Silver Creek in the afternoon light, and Elowen rode with the file under her arm and the exhaustion of 11 days finally settling into her bones. And for the first time since Carrie had come riding in with news of the moved markers, she let herself feel something other than the forward pressure of necessity. She felt the ranch around her, the land, the ridge to the west, where the water came off the hills and moved through the channel she had helped rebuild, down to the pasture that was 6 weeks greener than it had been the year before. The north fence line, repaired after the storm. The barn that had held against the flood because 3 men had dug a ditch in the dark at 3 in the morning because she had told them where to dig. She felt all of it, and she thought, I did not come here looking for this. But here it is, and I am not walking away from it. Harlan took the horses when they got back to Silver Creek, and he did it without being asked, which meant he understood that something was happening that required him to make himself scarce. And Harlan was a man who understood things without needing them explained. Elowen went to the cookhouse first. She set the file on the shelf. She washed her hands. She stood at the basin for a moment longer than washing required, looking at the water, feeling the weight of the day settling through her body the way cold settles slowly, completely, into every part of you at once. She had been awake for most of 11 days. She had built a legal case from a supply inventory and a midnight ride and 2 months of paying attention. She had sat in a county hearing room and been called a cook by a lawyer who thought that word ended the conversation, and she had answered him with facts until he sat down. She had won. Silver Creek had won. And now she had to go have the conversation she had been putting at the back of her mind for 6 days, behind all the preparation and the documentation and the writing and the hearing, because there had always been something more urgent than her own feelings, and now there wasn't. She dried her hands. She walked to the main house. Silas was already there. He had lit the lamps and built up the fire, and he was standing near the fireplace when she came in, and he turned when he heard the door, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has been waiting not impatiently, but with the full, focused attention of someone who has decided that this moment is the most important one in his near future, and he is going to be present for all of it. She sat down in the chair across from the fire. He sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. I've been thinking about what you said, she began. About wanting to know someone honestly. Before money got between you. Before position. Yes, he said. I understand the reasoning, she said. I want you to know that. I'm not pretending I can't see why a man in your position would make that choice. But, he said, but understanding a reason isn't the same as being comfortable with the consequence, she said. The consequence was that I trusted you with things I don't give out freely. My father's story, my own history, the reasons behind the way I work. I gave you those things because I believed I was giving them to a man who had nothing from me and wanted nothing except the truth. She paused. And he did want the truth, but he also had everything. The ranch, the authority, the ability to dismiss me or keep me or change my circumstances with a single word. And I didn't know that, and that matters. Silas looked at her steadily. You're right, he said. It matters. Don't agree with me just to smooth this over, she said sharply. I'm not, he said. I'm agreeing with you because you're correct. The power was unequal from the first day, and you didn't know it. And I let that continue longer than I should have, because he stopped. Say it, she said. Because I was afraid, he said. That if you knew it would change how you saw me. And the way you saw me, he looked at his hands, then back at her. The way you talked to me in the evenings, like I was just Silas who drank your coffee and told you where the root cellar was. I hadn't had that in a long time. I didn't want to lose it. She sat with that. The fire moved. Outside, the ranch was quiet in the way it gets in the late afternoon when the work is done and the animals are settled and the land holds its breath for a moment before dark. You were lonely, she said. Not an accusation, of fact. Yes, he said. Owning everything and being lonely anyway, she said. Yes, that's a particular kind of hard, she said. He looked at her. Don't feel sorry for me, he said. That's not why I told you. I don't feel sorry for you, she said. I recognize it. I've been lonely in different ways for a long time. You know that now, I do, he said. She leaned forward and put her elbows on her knees. Here's what I need from you, she said. Not an apology. I don't want an apology. I want to know that if I stay, if this is something we build, the two of us, together, that there are no more rooms I'm not allowed into. No more information you're holding back because you've decided it protects something. No more decisions made for me without asking me. You have my word, he said. Your word means something to me, she said. That's the only reason I'm sitting here saying this instead of asking Harlan to arrange a stage back to Laramie. Something moved through his face, quick and unguarded, the way things move through a man's face when he understands exactly what he almost lost, and the understanding hits all at once. Elowen, he said. I'm not finished, she said. He closed his mouth. If I stay, she said, I'm not staying as your cook. I'm not staying as your kept woman or your convenient helpmate or the woman who manages your household and looks decorative at your table. I have worked this ranch for 3 months, and I understand it better than most of your hands do, and I have spent 11 days building the legal case that just saved it. If I stay as someone whose name is attached to the decisions she makes. Someone with genuine authority over the parts of this operation she knows. Not because you love me, because I've earned it. The fire crackled. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. Yes, meaning you agree, she said. Yes, meaning I was going to ask you for exactly that, he said. Not the way you just framed it, because I'm not as direct as you are, and it would have taken me considerably longer to get there. But yes, that is what I want. I want a partner in this, Elowen. Not a cook, not a woman I'm grateful to. A partner. She studied him. You mean that, she said. I don't say things I don't mean, he said. You know that by now. She did know that. It was in fact one of the first things she had known about him, and one of the things that had made every conversation with him feel like solid ground. She sat back, she breathed. All right, she said. He waited. All right, she said again, more quietly, with a different weight to it. Then let's talk about what that looks like. What it looked like, as it turned out, was not a single conversation, but many spread across the weeks that followed the hearing. Conducted at the work table in the cookhouse, and at the desk in the study, and on horseback riding the property boundaries, and once, memorably, standing in the lower pasture watching the irrigation water move through the channel she had helped repair. Both of them talking about the spring planting plan, while somewhere underneath the practical words, something else was being said, slowly and carefully. The way things get said between people who have both been hurt before and are building something they don't want to drop. The sheriff's investigation into the boundary marker tampering produced results faster than anyone expected. On the 14th day after the hearing, a deputy arrived at Silver Creek with word that one of Vale's contracted surveyors had agreed to provide a statement. The man's name was Deacon, and he had apparently decided that his professional license was worth more than his loyalty to Gideon Vale, because his statement was complete and specific. He named Vale as the one who had ordered the markers moved. He named the 2 hands who had done the physical work. He provided the date, the time, and the equipment used. Harlan brought the news to the cookhouse, where Elowen was working through the spring supply calculations. She set down her pen. She looked at the wall for a moment. Deacon talked, she said. All of it, Harlan said. Vale ordered it himself. Night after Aldrin withdrew the county inquiry. The same night, she said, he didn't even wait. Didn't think he needed to, Harlan said. He thought it would be his surveyors versus our word. He didn't account for you having documentation from the scene inside 2 hours. She looked at her supply calculation sheet. Where's Silas, she said. In the barn, Harlan said. She got up. She found Silas examining a horse's leg in the second stall, crouched down, running his hand along the cannon bone. He looked up when he heard her come in. Deacon gave a full statement, she said. Vale ordered the tampering himself, the night after the hearing. Silas straightened slowly. The sheriff's office has enough for a criminal charge, she said. He looked at her. It's over, she said. Whatever angle Vale was going to try next, he can't run a land fraud scheme from inside a criminal proceeding. He's going to be busy enough protecting himself. Silas was quiet for a moment. You don't look as relieved as I expected, she said. I am relieved, he said. I'm also thinking about what comes next. Silver Creek, she said. That's what comes next. He looked at her with that full-weighted look. Yes, he said. Silver Creek. Elowen, he said. She turned back. He was still standing in the stall with the horse behind him and the light coming in from the high barn window, and he had the look of a man who had rehearsed something and then decided in the moment to say something different instead. I know we said we'd talk about what partnering looks like, said. The authority, the decisions, your name attached to the work. We are talking about it, she said. We've been talking about it for 2 weeks. I want to make it formal, he said. She went still. Not just an understanding between us, he said. Something that other people can see. Something that holds regardless of anything that might change. She looked at him carefully. What are you saying, Silas? He was quiet for a moment. I'm saying I want to marry you, he said. And I'm saying it plainly, because you told me not to hold back rooms, and this is a room I've been standing outside for a while now. The barn was very quiet. The horse shifted behind him. Elowen stood in the barn doorway and looked at the man who had stood beside her in the yard, and said she isn't wrong and had known about the root cellar, and had given her his coat when her hands were blue, and had owned everything around her from the first day, and had been the loneliest person on his own land until she came with one worn suitcase and almost no money and refused to be anything other than exactly what she was. That's a room, she said. I know, he said. I'm saying it anyway. She looked at him for a long moment. Ask me properly, she said. He came out of the stall. He stood in front of her, not performing anything, not constructing anything, just standing there the way he always stood with his full weight on the ground and his eyes on hers, and nothing held back. Elowen Mercer, he said, will you marry me? She felt the thing that had no name finally get its name. Yes, she said, but I meant what I said about the authority. I know you did, he said. My name on the decisions, she said. Yes, he said. Genuine partnership, she said. Yes, he said. Elowen. All right, she said. She stepped forward and she put her hand in his, the hand that was still rough from the cold of the midnight ride, against his hand that was rough from 20 years of fence work, and it was not a romantic gesture in the way that romance is usually described. It was a practical gesture between two people who had built their trust with their hands and their arithmetic and their midnight rides and their file folders and their arguments and their silences. And it was the most honest gesture either of them had made in a very long time. He held her hand. He did not let go immediately. She did not pull away. They stood in the barn in the quiet afternoon light, and outside Silver Creek Ranch went on around them, the cattle in the pasture, the hands at their work, the irrigation water moving through the channel. The snow still on the western ridge, beginning its slow melt toward the land below, and it was theirs. Both of theirs. Not because one of them owned it and the other had earned a place in it, but because they had fought for it together, and now they were standing in the middle of it, with their hands together, and the whole season ahead of them. The wedding was small. Elowen did not want large. Silas did not argue. They were married on a Saturday in May, in the yard of Silver Creek Ranch, with Harlan standing up for Silas and a woman named Clara, from the nearest town, standing up for Elowen. Clara, who ran the dry goods store and had fed Elowen coffee and information on 3 separate supply trips and had become, in the quietly practical way of frontier friendships, the closest thing to a friend Elowen had made in Wyoming territory. Dutch cried. He turned away and pretended he hadn't, but everyone saw, and nobody mentioned it, because Dutch had earned the right to feel things without commentary. Carrie made a joke that was almost funny. Pete and Will shook Silas's hand like they were trying to detach it from his arm. Harlan shook Elowen's hand, which surprised her, and then put his other hand over both of theirs and held them for a moment, which surprised her more, and she understood that this was Harlan's version of a speech, and she accepted it as such. That evening, sitting on the porch of the main house in the last of the spring light, Silas said, "What do you want to change first?" She had been thinking about this for weeks. The record keeping, she said. I want a proper system, not just my file and Harlan's file and the supply invoices in a box. A unified record for the whole operation: land, cattle, finances, labor, supplies. One system that anyone can read and understand. All right, he said. And I want to expand the irrigation, she said. The eastern pasture has a similar elevation profile to the western one. If we extend the channel system, Elowen, he said. She stopped. It's our wedding evening, he said. She looked at him. You asked what I wanted to change first. I did, he said. You knew what you were starting, she said. I did, he said. I just wanted to hear you planning. She looked at him sideways. You like it when I plan. I like it when you're thinking, he said. I can see it. The way your face goes when you're solving something. How does my face go? She said. Still, he said. Everything else goes still, and you get very focused and slightly dangerous looking. Dangerous, she said, in the best way, he said. She looked out at the ranch, the pasture where the cattle moved in the long evening light. The ridge to the west, the channel she had finished, quietly bringing water where it was needed. I want the men to have a say in their own conditions, she said. Ours, safety, disputes. I want a system where they can raise concerns without fear. The kind of place where a good hand wants to stay. Silas was quiet for a moment. That's going to take some adjusting, he said. Some of the older hands. Dutch will come around, she said. He already respects the work. He just needs to understand that respecting the work means respecting the people doing it. You've thought about Dutch, specifically, he said. Dutch is the bellwether, she said. If Dutch accepts it, the others will follow. He has more authority among the men than he knows. Silas looked at her. You've been studying my ranch hands, he said. I've been cooking for them for 3 months, she said. You learn a great deal about people when you feed them every day. He shook his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in the way of a man who is continually finding the edges of something larger than he initially mapped. Anything else, he said? The books, she said. I want to see the full financial records. Not the summary, the full accounts. He nodded. I'll have everything pulled tomorrow. Good, she said. Yes, the eastern pasture irrigation, she said. It's genuinely possible. The elevation drop is almost identical to the western profile. If we surveyed it this summer, write it up, he said. I already have a rough sketch, she said. He turned and looked at her. On our wedding day. On the ride back from town last week, she said. I had time to think. He stared at her for a moment. And then he laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind of laugh that comes out of a man who has been serious for a long time, and has found something genuinely funny and genuinely good at the same time. She had not heard him laugh like that before. She decided she liked it considerably. The summer that followed was the hardest work of Elowen's life and the best summer she had lived. She implemented the unified record system in the first month, spent 3 weeks rebuilding every file in the operation into a single coherent structure. Cross-referenced and dated and annotated in plain language that anyone on the ranch could read without a lawyer's help. Harlan worked beside her on it without complaint, which told her he had been waiting for someone to do exactly this for longer than she'd been there. She surveyed the eastern pasture with Kellerman, who had agreed to come back to Silver Creek under conditions that were now considerably more pleasant than a midnight emergency, and the elevation profile was as she had calculated. The eastern irrigation extension was a larger project than the western channel repair. It required new construction rather than restoration, and it took 12 men 6 weeks to build. But it worked. The eastern pasture came into condition 8 weeks earlier than its historical average. When the summer cattle count came in, Silver Creek showed the strongest numbers in 6 years. The men's working conditions changed more slowly than the irrigation did. Change among people is always slower than change in land, because land doesn't have opinions about the way things used to be. Dutch was, as Elowen had predicted, the bellwether. She approached him directly, 3 weeks into the summer, while he was working leather at the bunkhouse door. I want to talk to you about something, she said. He looked up. He had the slightly defensive look of a man who expects to be asked to change his habits. Not asking you to do anything, she said immediately. I want your opinion. His expression shifted. My opinion, he said. On what would make this a place a good hand never wants to leave, she said. You've been here longer than almost anyone. You know what it's been and what it could be. Dutch was quiet for a moment. He worked the leather. He was thinking. Water for the bunkhouse that doesn't freeze in January, he said. A proper system, not buckets. Done, she said. What else? He looked at her. He had not expected that to be easy. Medical supplies, he said. More than a bandage roll and half a bottle of carbolic. Men get hurt out here. It's a 3-hour ride to a doctor. I'll put together a proper kit, she said, and I'll learn to use it, so someone on this ranch knows what they're doing when something happens. He set the leather down. You'd learn that. I'd learn anything that keeps the men working and healthy, she said. What else, he thought for a long time. Fair hearing, he said. When there's a dispute between men, or between a man and management. Something where a body can say his piece without worrying about losing his position just for speaking. I'm building that system, she said. I need someone the men trust to be part of it. Someone who'll hear both sides and say what's fair. I was thinking of asking you. Dutch stared at her. She waited. You want me to sit on some kind of board, he said carefully. A hearing process, she said, but real. Your word carries weight. That's useful. Dutch picked up the leather again. He worked it for a moment. She could see him turning the offer over, looking at it from different sides. I'd want it clear that my word means something, he said. Not just an old hand they let talk. Your word means something or I wouldn't be asking, she said. He nodded. Once. Slow. All right, he said. She thanked him and walked away and did not make a production of it, because making a production of it would have embarrassed him, and embarrassed Dutch was an obstacle. But Dutch, who believed his opinion was genuinely wanted, was something else entirely. 2 days later, Dutch started explaining to the other men why the new working conditions were a good idea. He did it as if it were his own conclusion, which was fine. It was, in the end, partly his conclusion. Elowen let him have that. She understood that letting people have their conclusions was not weakness. It was how you got things done among people who had pride. Gideon Vale's criminal case moved through the county system over the summer with the slow, grinding certainty of a millstone. He hired Greer and 2 other lawyers. He filed motions and countermotions and demanded reviews and raised procedural objections that bought him time but not outcome. Deacon's testimony held. The displaced markers had been photographed by Kellerman. At Elowen's request, she had thought of that in the cold dark on the ridge, and asked him to do it before they left the site, and the photographs were unambiguous. In October, Gideon Vale pleaded to a reduced charge in exchange for a permanent withdrawal of all claims against Silver Creek Ranch and a signed agreement that he would not initiate any property, boundary, water, or cattle dispute against the ranch for a period of 20 years. 20 years. Silas brought the signed agreement home and put it on the desk in the study, and stood back and looked at it. Harlan looked at it. Elowen looked at it. 20 years, Harlan said. Yes, Silas said. He'll be 70-something in 20 years, Harlan said. He will, Silas said. So this is it, Harlan said. This is it, Silas said. Harlan picked up the agreement and read it through carefully. Then he set it down. He picked up his hat. He put it on. He walked to the door. At the door he stopped and looked back at Elowen. That file you built, he said. Without that file, this document doesn't exist. Then he walked out. She stood in the study, with the signed agreement on the desk, and the lamp burning warm and Silas on the other side of the desk looking at her, and she felt the thing she had been carrying for almost a year, the weight of it. The vigilance and the arithmetic and the midnight rides and the hearings and the preparing and the fighting, she felt it put itself down. Not gone, not forgotten, put down, Like a tool you don't need to hold anymore because the work is done and it can rest on the shelf where it belongs. Are you all right? Silas said. She realized her eyes had gone wet. She pressed her fingers against them briefly. Yes, she said. Yes. He came around the desk. He stood beside her the way he always stood beside her, close, not touching until she was ready, giving her room to be whatever she was without rushing it. She turned toward him, and she put her forehead against his shoulder, and he put his arms around her, and she stood there for a moment with her eyes closed, feeling the solid, quiet presence of him, and she breathed. My father never got this, she said quietly. I know, he said. 3 years he fought, she said, and lost everything. And we left, I know, he said. We didn't lose, she said. No, he said, we didn't. She stood back, she wiped her eyes once quickly with the back of her hand. She looked at him. The eastern extension is almost ready for the spring, she said. He almost smiled. I know the bunkhouse water system needs inspection before the freeze, she said. Carries on it, he said, the winter supply order. Elowen, he said. It's done, he said. Tonight it's done. She looked at him for a moment. All right, she said. Tonight it's done. The first snow came in November, and Silver Creek Ranch met it differently than it had the year before. The supply room was full, not carefully stretched, not barely sufficient, but genuinely full. Planned 6 weeks in advance with Elowen's supply schedule and ordered through a new arrangement with the Laramie merchant that gave Silver Creek better terms because they ordered predictably and paid on time. The bunkhouse water system was solid. The medical kit was stocked, and Elowen had spent 3 evenings with a manual from the county doctor learning how to use every item in it. The records were organized. The accounts were current. The men knew their working conditions and their recourse, and their foreman and their employer, and they worked the land with the particular commitment of people who believe the place they work is being run with care. Harlan told Silas in November that 3 hands who had been considering moving on had decided to stay. Silas told Elowen. She was writing the winter supply schedule at the work table when he told her, and she set her pen down and looked at the table for a moment. Good, she said. Dutch did good work. Dutch was your idea, Silas said. Dutch was Dutch's idea, she said. I just gave him a room to be it in. He sat down across from her. He looked at the supply schedule. She was building neat columns, careful quantities, margin notes about substitution options. You're planning for the East pasture cattle expansion, he said, reading her margin notes. If the spring grazing comes in as projected, we can carry 20 more head, she said. Which means we need to plan the winter feed budget now, not in February when the prices have moved. He looked at the sheet. He looked at her. Elowen, he said. She said, picking up her pen. I want to tell you something, he said. She looked up. His expression was the one she had learned over the past months to recognize as the real one, not the professional weight, not the careful consideration, but the one underneath all of that. Where the loneliness used to be, and where something else lived now. What? She said. I fell in love with you before I understood what that meant, he said. I think I started somewhere around the morning you came back from the ridge with the water report. I didn't know what to call it then. I called it trust. She set her pen down properly this time, and now she said, Now I know what to call it, he said, and it's larger than I expected. And it changes every time I see you think. She looked at him. I didn't fall in love with the owner of Silver Creek Ranch, she said. He waited. I fell in love with the man who stood beside me in the yard when I was just the cook, she said. The man who knew where the root cellar was and sat in my kitchen at 3 a.m. because the barn needed saving, and then gave me his coat because my hands were blue. She paused. That's who I fell in love with. Everything else came after. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. They sat at the work table in the warm cookhouse, with the winter coming in hard outside and the supply schedule between them and their hands together in the middle of it. And it was not a grand moment. It was a quiet one, the kind that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. the kind that lasts. What Silver Creek Ranch became over the years that followed was not the product of any single decision or any single person. It was the product of two people who understood that running a place well meant running it honestly, with accounts and real records, and real regard for the people who worked the land alongside them. The unified record system Elowen built in their first summers together became the model that two neighboring ranches eventually asked to copy. She showed them without charge because the goal was not advantage over neighbors, but a region that knew how to keep itself sound. The irrigation system, both the restored Western Channel and the new Eastern Extension, was studied by a man from the Territorial Agricultural Office who came out in the second summer and asked Elowen to walk him through the engineering of it. She walked him through it for 3 hours and answered every question he had, and when he left, he had 12 pages of notes and a better understanding of how to bring water to dry land than he'd had when he arrived. The approach was shared in the territorial report that year. She was listed as a ranch manager, not a cook, a ranch manager. She kept the supply inventory from her first night at Silver Creek. She kept it in the file on the second shelf of the main house study, where it had lived since Harlan moved it there during the preparation for the hearing. She kept it because it was the beginning of the record, the first page of the accounting of everything she had seen and done and known about this place. On the anniversary of her arrival 1 year from the October afternoon, she had stepped off the stage with her worn leather suitcase and stood in the yard and looked at what she'd been given. She took the inventory down from the shelf and sat at the work table and read it. Flour not enough, salt, pork, some dried beans, a reasonable amount. She sat with it for a while. Then Silas came in for coffee and saw her at the table with the old paper, and he poured 2 cups and sat across from her. "That's the first night inventory," he said. "Yes," she said. "I remember that night," he said. "I came in for coffee and you were writing." "I remember," she said. "I thought you were writing a letter," he said. "Supply inventory," she said. "I know that now," he said. He picked up his coffee. "What are you thinking about?" She looked at the paper. "I'm thinking about the fact that I came here because I needed a job," she said. 11 cents in my pocket and a coat that wasn't warm enough. I took the position because it was available, and I could do it, and I had run out of better options. "Yes," he said, "and I stayed not because of you," she said. "Not at first. I stayed because this was the first place in years where what I knew was actually used. Where I could see a problem and solve it and have the solution taken seriously." He nodded. He was listening the way he always listened, completely, without preparing his response while she was still talking. "That's the thing I want people to understand," she said. "If anyone ever tells this story, it wasn't about finding out you owned the ranch. It wasn't about love saving the day. It was about a woman who knew things, and a place that finally let her use them. That's why I stayed. That's the beginning of everything else." He looked at her across the table. "Then that's what I'll tell them," he said. "Tell who?" she said. "Anyone who asks," he said, "about Silver Creek. About how it became what it is." She looked at the inventory in her hands. "Tell them the cook knew what she was doing," she said. "From the first night she did," he said. "Tell them the quiet cowboy was smarter than he let on," she said. "He tried to be," he said. "Tell them the ranch survived because 2 people decided to trust each other," she said. "Not all at once, piece by piece, the way you build anything that's meant to last." He reached across the table and she met him halfway, and their hands held the way they had learned to hold, comfortable and certain. With the particular grip of 2 people who have chosen each other not in a single dramatic moment, but in 100 small ones, and know the weight of what they're holding. Outside, Silver Creek Ranch went on the way it always went on the cattle in the expanded pasture, the water moving through both channels now. The men at their work with their foreman and their fair hearing process, and their properly stocked bunkhouse, the supply room full, the records complete, the land mapped and documented and cared for and known. The woman who had arrived with 1 worn suitcase and almost no money and refused to be discouraged had become the person the ranch could not have been what it was without. Not because she had fallen in love with the right man. Not because she had found wealth she hadn't expected. But because she had shown up on the first day and done the work completely, and kept doing it, and refused at every point to be less than what she was. Eloise Mercer had come to Silver Creek believing she had accepted nothing more than a cook's position. What she had actually accepted was the beginning of everything she had ever been capable of, given room at last, to be fully itself. And Silver Creek Ranch, with its records and its water and its repaired channel and its fair-treated hands and its unified accounts and its signed agreement that Gideon Vale would never trouble them again. Silver Creek Ranch was the proof of what happens when a woman who knows what she's doing finally finds a place that knows what it has. She had never been just the cook. She had always been the person who would save the ranch, who would document it, and defend it, and fight for it, and build it into something that would last past both their lifetimes. Silas had hired the cook. What walked through his gate that October afternoon was the best decision Silver Creek Ranch ever made. And the land remembered it. The land always does.